Tonight we will embark on a gentle journey, not to a destination, but into presence. We will explore the timeless wisdom of the Buddha, teachings that have served as a refuge for restless minds for over 2,500 years. These are not rules to follow or doctrines to memorize. They are invitations. Invitations to see differently, to soften your grip, and to uncover the deep well of peace that has been within you all along. We will walk this path through ancient stories and simple, profound truths that speak not to the busy mind, but to the quiet, knowing heart. We will learn to see our thoughts not as masters, but as passing clouds, and our difficult emotions not as enemies, but as messengers inviting us toward healing. Welcome to Buddha Bedtime Stories. This is your sanctuary, a space to rest your mind and nourish your spirit. There is nothing you need to do, nothing to fix, and no one you need to become. Simply allow these words to wash over you. Before we begin, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you listening from tonight? Please share in the comments below. If this path of quiet reflection calls to something deep within you, I invite you to subscribe to Buddha Bedtime Stories and return to this space whenever you need to remember the peace that is your birthright. These teachings are here for you, night after night, a refuge you can always return to. For now, just breathe. Let yourself settle completely. Feel the surface beneath you, holding your weight. Notice your breath moving naturally, asking nothing of you. Take a slow, deep breath in, and as you exhale, let yourself arrive here fully. Let us begin this journey together. Our journey into deep peace begins with a gentle, honest look at the nature of our own minds. It starts with one of the most foundational teachings of the Buddha. In a village where everyone prided themselves on their sophistication and education, there lived a simple man named Saburo who worked as a night watchman. His job was to walk through the streets after dark, making sure all was well, that no fires had started, that no trouble was brewing. Saburo had little education. He couldn't read the classical texts that the village scholars discussed. He didn't understand philosophy or poetry. The educated people of the village looked down on him somewhat, considering him simple, perhaps even slow-witted. But Saburo had one practice that brought him deep joy. On his nightly rounds, whenever he found a puddle that reflected the moon, he would stop and gaze at it. He would crouch down beside these puddles and smile at the perfect circle of light floating in the water, no matter how small or muddy the puddle was. One night, a scholar named Masato was walking home late from a dinner party where there had been much wine and intellectual discussion. He came upon Saburo crouching beside a small puddle, staring into it with a look of wonder. "Saburo!" Masato called out, his words slightly slurred. "What are you doing down there in the mud?" "Looking at the moon," Saburo replied, not taking his eyes from the puddle. Masato laughed. "That's not the moon, you fool. That's just a reflection. The real moon is up there." He pointed to the sky, where the full moon hung bright and distant. "I know," Saburo said simply, "but I can't touch the real moon. It's too far away. This moon in the puddle, I can see it up close. I can watch it shimmer when the wind blows. I can see clouds pass across it. It's right here with me." "But it's not real," Masato insisted. It's just an image, a copy. Why waste time looking at a reflection when you could look at the actual moon? Saburo finally looked up at Masato. I look at both. The moon in the sky is beautiful, but the moon in the puddle is beautiful too. And this one, I can be close to. This one shares the street with me. Why should I ignore it just because it's a reflection? Masato shook his head and walked away, chuckling at the simple watchman's foolishness. But a traveling Zen monk had overheard this exchange. He approached Saburo and sat down beside the puddle. "May I look at the moon with you?" the monk asked. Saburo smiled and moved over to make room. Together, they gazed at the reflection in the puddle. After a while, the monk said, "That scholar thinks you're simple. He thinks you don't understand the difference between the real moon and its reflection." "I understand the difference," Saburo said quietly. "I just don't think it matters as much as he does." "Tell me what you mean," the monk said. Saburo thought for a moment, then spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "The scholar says the moon in the puddle isn't real. But I'm seeing it right now. It's making light in the water. It's changing as I watch it. How is that not real? Maybe it's not the same as the moon in the sky, but it's not nothing. It's something. And that something brings me joy." The monk nodded, saying nothing, encouraging Saburo to continue. People like Masato think some experiences are real and important, and other experiences are just reflections, just copies, not worth their time. But I don't see it that way. When I see beauty in a puddle, I'm really seeing it. When I feel peace looking at the moon's reflection, I'm really feeling it. Just because it's a reflection doesn't make my experience less real. The monk smiled broadly. "You understand something that the scholar doesn't. He's so concerned with distinguishing between original and copy, between real and reflected, that he misses the truth. All experience is real experience, even if it's experience of a reflection. The joy you feel looking at this puddle moon is not reflected. It's actual joy." They sat together in silence for a while longer. Then the monk said, "There's a teaching in Zen about the moon and its reflection. It says that trying to grasp the absolute truth is like trying to grab the moon in the sky. But seeing truth in everyday life is like seeing the moon reflected in water. We can't touch the infinite directly, but we experience it through its reflections in ordinary moments. You've understood this naturally, without studying." Saburo looked puzzled. "I don't know about truth or the infinite. I just like looking at the moon in puddles." "That's exactly what I mean," the monk laughed. "The scholar knows many teachings but understands little. You know no teachings but understand much." Word of this conversation spread through the village. Some people thought it was just another example of Saburo's simplicity being mistaken for wisdom. But others began to think differently about reflections. A woman who had been dismissing her own life as less important than the lives of famous people she read about, realized that her experience of love, loss, joy, and sorrow was not a lesser version of human experience. It was human experience itself. The fact that no one wrote books about her life didn't make her life less real. A man who had been ashamed of his humble work, comparing it constantly to the prestigious careers of others, recognized that his satisfaction in work well done was not a reflected satisfaction, It was real satisfaction, no less valuable for coming from ordinary labor than satisfaction from celebrated achievement. A child who loved to draw but was told her art was just copying the real world, understood suddenly that her experience of creating was real creating, even if she was working from life rather than pure imagination. The monk stayed in the village for several weeks, and people noticed that he would often walk with Saburo on his night rounds. They would stop at puddles together, looking at reflections of the moon, stars, and lantern light. The educated people found this baffling. Why would a learned monk waste time with a simple watchman looking at puddles? But others began to join them. At first, just one or two, then more. They would walk the night streets, stopping at puddles, looking at reflected light, experiencing the strange beauty of seeing the distant brought near, the vast captured in the small. One night, Masato the scholar, humbled by wine, or perhaps by something else, joined the group. He crouched beside a puddle and looked at the moon's reflection. At first, all he could think was, "This isn't the real moon." But gradually, as he watched, something shifted. He stopped comparing the reflection to the original and simply experienced what was before him. Light in water, movement and shimmer, beauty is accessible and close. He found, to his surprise, that he was moved, not by the moon itself, which he had seen countless times, but by this moment of looking at light in a puddle, surrounded by others who were also looking, all of them sharing this simple, real experience. "I understand now," he said quietly to Saburo. "I've been so busy distinguishing between real and reflected that I forgot that all of it is real. The moon in the sky is real. The moon in the puddle is real. And my experience of looking at either one is real. Nothing is lesser just because it's a reflection." Saburo smiled. "The puddle moon is closer. I like that about it." Years later, when travelers asked what was special about this village, people would tell them about the night walks, the puddle gazing, the practice of seeing reflections not as inferior copies, but as real encounters with beauty brought near. And they would tell them about Saburo, the watchman who taught a village full of educated people, that reflection is not the opposite of reality. Reflection is reality in another form. Experience is experience, whether of original or copy, source or reflection. The joy is real. The beauty is real. The moment is real. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what experiences you've been dismissing as just reflections. What joys have you minimized because they weren't the real thing? What beauty have you ignored because it came to you secondhand, through a screen, through a retelling, through some medium other than direct contact? All experience is real experience. The peace you feel listening to these words is not reflected peace, it's actual peace. The rest you're settling into is not a copy of rest, it's real rest. You don't have to touch the moon directly to experience moonlight. You don't have to live someone else's life to experience real life. Your experience right now, reflection or not, is completely real. Rest in the truth that this moment, this breath, this experience of being here is not practice for the real thing. It is the real thing. Nothing is lacking. Nothing needs to be more direct or more authentic. This is it. In this reflection, you call your life your actual life. These reflections, you call your experiences, are your actual experiences. And they are enough, more than enough, They are real. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a tale about recognition and the true nature of worth. This is the next story. In the capital city lived a tea master named Soho, who had spent 50 years perfecting the art of the tea ceremony. His movements were flawless, his timing exact, his aesthetic sense refined beyond what most people could achieve in several lifetimes. Every detail of his ceremonies was considered and precise. The angle of the bowl, the temperature of the water, the moment to pass the tea, the positioning of each implement. Soho's ceremonies were legendary. People would wait years for an invitation to attend. Wealthy patrons offered fortunes to have Soho perform ceremonies for their guests. Other tea masters studied his techniques, trying to replicate his perfection. But Soho himself had grown troubled. Despite his technical mastery, despite the acclaim, he felt his ceremonies had become performances rather than genuine expressions of tea mind. He was so focused on executing each movement perfectly that he had lost connection to the spirit beneath the movements. His ceremonies were flawless, but somehow empty. On his 70th birthday, Soho decided to retire from public ceremonies. He would perform one final tea ceremony, a farewell to his long career, and then step away to live simply in a small temple. He prepared meticulously for this final ceremony. He invited only his closest students and a few respected elders who had followed his work for decades. He selected implements he had used for years, choosing each for its history and meaning. He practiced the movements daily in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, ensuring everything would be perfect. The day of the ceremony arrived. Soho entered the tea room with his usual grace, began with his usual precision. His guests watched in respectful silence, knowing they were witnessing a master's final performance. Then, midway through the ceremony, something unexpected happened. As Soho reached for the tea bowl, his hand trembled slightly. Whether from age, emotion, or simple nervousness, he couldn't say. The tremor caused him to fumble the bowl. It didn't fall or break, but his grip was clumsy, his movement awkward. The flow of the ceremony was disrupted by this imperfect moment. Soho's first instinct was mortification. After 50 years of perfect execution, his final ceremony was marred by a clumsy mistake. But then something shifted in him. The mistake had broken his focus on perfection, and in that break, he suddenly felt present in a way he hadn't been during a ceremony in years. He picked up the bowl, not with perfect grace, but with simple honesty, with the actual movement of an old man holding a bowl. He continued the ceremony, but something had changed. He was no longer performing perfectly. He was just making tea, sharing tea, being present with his guests. The movements that followed weren't as technically flawless as usual, but they had a quality his perfect performances had lacked. They were real. They were Soho actually being here, making tea, connecting with his guests, rather than Soho executing a perfect reproduction of the tea master role. When the ceremony ended, there was a long silence. Then one of the elder guests spoke. "That was the finest tea ceremony I have ever experienced." Soho was confused. "But I made mistakes. The execution wasn't clean." "The execution was finally clean," the elder replied. "Clean of performance, clean of ego, clean of the need to be perfect. For the first time in decades, I saw you actually making tea rather than demonstrating how tea should be made." Your fumble was the most important moment of the ceremony. It dropped you out of performance and into presence. Another guest agreed. I've attended 6 of your ceremonies over the years. They were all technically superior to today's, but this one touched me in a way the others never did. The imperfection made it human. It made it real. It made it about tea rather than about perfection. Soho sat with this feedback for a long time. He realized that his 50-year pursuit of perfect execution had taken him away from genuine expression. He had become so skilled at performing the tea ceremony that he had forgotten how to simply make tea with presence and care. I thought mastery meant perfect execution, Soho told his students later. I thought the goal was to perform each movement so exactly that no flaw could be found. But that kind of mastery is dead. It's impressive, but not alive. Today, when I fumbled and had to let go of perfection, I finally rediscovered what tea ceremony is actually about. Presence, connection, the simple act of sharing tea with other humans. He looked at his hands, still slightly trembling. These old hands that made a mistake taught me more than 50 years of perfect practice. They taught me that perfect execution becomes perfect only when you stop trying to perfect it, when you let go of performance and sink into presence. One student asked, "So should we not practice? Should we not work toward technical excellence?" "Practice," Soho replied. "Develop your technique. But don't let technique become an end in itself. Practice until the movements are natural, then let go of trying to perform them perfectly. Use your technique to support presence, not to replace it. Master the form so completely that you can forget the form and just be here, making tea." He picked up a tea bowl, holding it with the same slight tremble. "See this imperfection? This is actually perfection because it's real. It's an old man's hand actually holding a bowl. The steady, flawless grip I cultivated for decades was impressive, but it was also a kind of lie. It hid my actual hand behind a perfect performance. This trembling hand is honest, and honesty is more important than perfection." In the weeks following his final ceremony, Soho began making tea in a completely different way. He still had all his technical skills, all his aesthetic sensitivity, but he used them lightly, allowing imperfection, welcoming the unexpected, staying present with what was actually happening rather than executing a mental script. He made tea for strangers, for children, for anyone who wanted to share a bowl. These weren't formal ceremonies with guests and perfect settings. They were just tea, made with care, shared with presence. And people felt more touched by these simple offerings than they had by his legendary perfect ceremonies. "You've become a greater tea master by letting go of mastery," one visitor observed. "I've become an actual tea master by letting go of the performance of mastery," Soho clarified. "I was skilled before, but I wasn't real. Now I'm both skilled and real. The skill supports the reality rather than replacing it. That's the difference." A young tea student struggling to perfect his own technique asked Soho for guidance. "How do I know when my practice is good enough? When can I stop trying to perfect my movements? When perfection becomes a barrier rather than a path," Soho replied. "Practice until the movements are natural and trustworthy. Then let go of trying to make them perfect and just let them be. The movement from practice to performance to presence, that's the journey. Most people stop at performance, endlessly perfecting their execution. The final step is letting go of perfection and discovering presence. He made tea for the young student, his hands moving with practiced skill, but also with slight tremors, small imperfections, human reality. See how I make tea now? I'm not performing or demonstrating, I'm just making tea. The years of practice allow me to do it well, but letting go of perfection allows me to do it truly. Both are necessary, but the second is what makes it complete. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what you've been perfecting, performing, trying to execute flawlessly. What would happen if you let your hands tremble slightly? If you allowed imperfection? If you stopped performing mastery and just did the thing itself, present and real? Perfect execution is impressive, but presence is what actually connects, what actually matters, what actually makes any practice complete. You've practiced enough, you've refined enough. Now it's time to let go of perfection and discover what's on the other side. Not sloppiness, not carelessness, but genuine presence that includes both skill and imperfection, both mastery and humanity. Rest now in this completion. Let yourself fumble slightly. Let yourself be real rather than perfect. The Tea Master's Last Cup teaches that the journey ends not in flawless execution, but in authentic presence. You've arrived, not at perfection, but at something better. Yourself, skilled and real, doing what you do with care and presence, and the slight tremble of actual human hands. That's perfection. That's the completion. That's the teaching. Sleep now, no longer performing, just being. This is enough. You are enough. The perfect becomes perfect when you stop trying to perfect it. As we move deeper into the quiet teachings of Zen, we come to a story about seeing clearly and understanding true value. Listen carefully to the next story. There was a painter named Hiro who specialized in landscapes, particularly sunsets. He would travel to scenic locations, set up his easel, and capture the magnificent colors of the evening sky. His paintings were admired and purchased by wealthy collectors throughout the region, but Hiro harbored a secret anxiety. He worried that beauty only existed when someone was there to witness it. If a sunset occurred and no one saw it, was it still beautiful? If a mountain stood in perfect light, but no human eye appreciated it, did that beauty mean anything? This philosophical worry grew into an obsession. Hiro began to feel that his purpose as an artist was essential, that without him and others like him to witness and record beauty, that beauty was somehow wasted, meaningless, lost. He expressed this concern to a Zen monk named Daigu, who lived near one of Hiro's favorite painting locations. If I didn't come here to paint these sunsets, they would just happen and disappear with no one to appreciate them. Doesn't that seem like a waste? Daigu looked at Hiro with gentle amusement. Let me ask you something. Before humans existed, before there were any conscious beings to witness them, did sunsets occur? Yes, I suppose so. And were they beautiful? How could they be beautiful if there was no one to see them? Ah, Daigu said. So you believe beauty is created by the observer rather than existing in the observed? This question troubled Hiro. He had always thought beauty was a quality inherent in things, but maybe he was wrong. Maybe beauty was just a human interpretation, a meaning we project onto neutral phenomena. Daigu continued, Tonight, stay at my temple. In the morning before dawn, I'll show you something. That night, Hiro could barely sleep, wondering what the monk would show him. Before sunrise, Daigu woke him and led him to a secluded valley far from any human habitation. "We're going to leave now," Daigu said, "and we're not going to look back. This evening, the sunset will occur here, with no human to witness it. According to your theory, that sunset will not be beautiful because there's no one to appreciate it." "But how will we know?" Hiro asked. "Exactly," Daigu smiled. "How will we know? And does not knowing change anything about what actually happens?" They left the valley and returned to the temple. All day, Hiro thought about the sunset occurring in that empty valley. The sky is going through its evening transformation with no human eye to see it. Colors blooming and fading with no one to call them beautiful. That evening, sitting with Daigu as the sun set over the temple, Hiro said, "Right now, in that valley, the sunset is happening. And it's the same sky, the same light, the same colors as here. The only difference is, we're not there to see it." "And?" Daigu prompted. "And I realize my presence doesn't create the beauty. It just allows me to participate in it. The sunset doesn't need me to witness it to be what it is. My witnessing is a gift I receive, not a gift I give to the sunset." Daigu nodded. "The mountains were beautiful before humans arrived and will be beautiful after humans are gone. The sunset performs its daily miracle whether anyone watches or not. Beauty is not dependent on observers. It exists. Our observation of it is our privilege, not our creation or our responsibility." This understanding transformed Hiro's relationship with his art. He had been painting with a sense of urgent mission, as if he needed to capture and preserve beauty before it was lost to obscurity. Now, he painted with gratitude, recognizing that he was participating in beauty, not rescuing it. His paintings changed. They became less about controlling and capturing, and more about celebrating and sharing. Critics said his later work had a quality of joy that his earlier, technically superior work had lacked. One student asked Hiro, "If beauty exists without observers, why paint at all? Why bother witnessing it?" "Because witnessing is a joy," Hiro replied, "not a duty. I don't paint because the sunset needs me. I paint because I need the sunset. Being present to beauty enriches me. Sharing that experience with others through my paintings is a gift I offer. But the beauty itself doesn't depend on my offering. It simply is." He told the student about the sunset in the empty valley. "Somewhere right now, a magnificent sunset is occurring that no human will ever see. No photograph will capture it. No painting will record it. It will happen and end and be gone forever from human knowledge. And that's perfect. That sunset doesn't exist for us. It exists because the earth turns and light bends and atmosphere scatters color. We're fortunate when we get to witness it, but our witnessing isn't required." This lesson extended beyond sunsets to everything in Hiro's life. He realized he'd been placing himself at the center of existence, as if things needed him to matter. But actually, everything had its own existence, its own worth, independent of his awareness or appreciation. The tree in his garden was a tree whether he noticed it or not. The bird singing in the morning was completing its nature whether he heard it or not. The stars were shining whether he looked up at them or not. His presence as an observer was optional, not essential. Everything existed quite fully without him. This could feel depressing, he told Daegu later. Realizing that I'm not essential, that everything would continue without me. Or it could feel liberating, Daegu replied. You don't have to carry the burden of making things matter. They already matter. Your role is simply to participate, to witness, to celebrate when you're fortunate enough to be present. This is a much lighter burden than thinking you must observe everything to validate its existence. Years later, when Hiro was old and knew he was dying, a young painter came to him, worried. When I die, who will paint these mountains? Who will witness these sunsets? Will all this beauty be wasted? Hiro smiled, remembering his own younger anxieties. The beauty will be what it has always been, complete and independent of observers. Other people will witness it. And even if no people witnessed it, it would still be itself, still be beautiful in its own right. You're not the author of beauty. You're just a fortunate participant in it. Paint while you can, witness what you're able to, and rest easy knowing that beauty doesn't depend on you to exist. Tonight, as you rest, you might find relief in this teaching. The world doesn't need you to be constantly observing, appreciating, and validating it for it to have worth. Your life has value. Your presence matters, but not because everything depends on you. Rather, because you get to participate in existence, to witness beauty, to experience being alive. This moment, right now, is happening whether you're paying attention or not. The universe is unfolding whether you're conscious of it or not. You can rest completely, releasing all concern that you need to be witnessing and validating and appreciating every moment. Some moments will happen without you. Some beauty will bloom and fade unseen. And that's perfect. That's how it should be. Rest in the understanding that you're not the center of existence, but a participant in it, a grateful guest, not a required audience. Let the world exist without your constant attention. Let beauty be beautiful, whether you're watching or not. This is freedom. This is peace. This is the deep rest of knowing you can stop, can close your eyes, can let go completely, and everything will continue being exactly what it is. There was a calligrapher named Setsuko who took great pride in her work. She would spend hours creating each character, each stroke perfect, each piece a work of art that she expected would last for generations. One day, she acquired a special ink that a merchant had brought from a distant province. The ink created beautiful deep blacks and flowed perfectly from her brush. But she soon discovered it had an unusual property. It never fully dried. Even days after she had finished a piece, the ink remained slightly wet. If you touched it, even carefully, it would smudge. At first, Setsuko was furious. She couldn't sell work that would smudge. She couldn't give pieces as gifts, knowing they would be ruined by the first careless touch. All her effort was going into work that couldn't be preserved. She tried everything to make the ink dry properly, but nothing worked. Finally, in frustration, she went to the merchant who had sold it to her, demanding her money back. The merchant looked surprised, but that's the nature of this ink. I told you it was special. Special? It's defective. It won't dry. Exactly, the merchant said. It's teaching ink. It reminds you that nothing you create is permanent. Your beautiful calligraphy will eventually fade. whether from age or damage or fire. This ink just makes the impermanence more obvious. Setsuko went home angry, but she couldn't stop thinking about the merchant's words. Everything she created would eventually be destroyed. The ink that wouldn't dry was just being honest about what was true of all her work. She began to approach her calligraphy differently. Instead of creating pieces meant to last forever, she started creating pieces meant for the moment. She would write on large papers and hang them in her studio, knowing they would slowly smudge and blur over time. She found this liberating. Each piece was perfect for now, and its eventual deterioration was part of its nature, not a tragedy. She began inviting people to come and breathe near her work, to let their breath slowly alter the still wet ink. The pieces became collaborations with time and circumstance, always changing, never fixed. "I was trying to create permanent beauty," she told a student, "but permanence doesn't exist. Everything changes. This ink taught me to make peace with that, to create beauty that's beautiful right now, without needing it to last forever." Tonight, what are you trying to make permanent that was always meant to change? What are you clinging to as if you could freeze it in time? Everything you love, everything you create, everything you are, it's all like ink that won't quite dry. Always shifting, always changing, always vulnerable to smudging. This isn't a tragedy. It's just the nature of existence. Let go of needing things to be permanent. Enjoy them while they're here. Create them knowing they'll change. Love them knowing they'll pass. The impermanence isn't the problem. Your fight against impermanence is. Rest now in the acceptance that nothing lasts forever, and that's what makes this moment precious. With each step on the Zen path, a new lesson unfolds. Now we turn to a story about recognition, of self, of others, and of what truly matters. Listen carefully to the next story. In a village garden, there lived a harmless snake that ate insects and kept the vegetable patch healthy. The gardener, an old man named Hideaki, appreciated the snake and would nod to it when he saw it sunning itself on stones or moving slowly through the rows of vegetables. The snake was small, no thicker than Hideaki's thumb, with gentle eyes and a pattern of brown and green scales that helped it blend with the garden soil. It had lived in the garden for several years, and Hideaki had watched it grow from a tiny hatchling to its current modest size. It was a completely harmless species, one that ate only insects and small slugs, never anything larger. The snake wanted nothing to do with humans and would quickly slither away if anyone approached too closely. But Hideaki's grandson, a boy named Kyo, who was 8 years old, was terrified of the snake. He had never been bitten, never been threatened, never had any negative encounter with it at all. But he had heard stories from other children about snakes being dangerous. His friend's older brother had told elaborate tales about venomous snakes that could kill a person with one bite. Another child had described snakes as evil creatures that attacked without warning. So every time Kyo caught a glimpse of the garden snake, he would run away screaming. His heart would race. His breath would come short and fast. His whole body would flood with terror. The sight of that small, harmless creature would send him into complete panic. Hideaki tried many times to reason with his grandson. "Kyo, this snake is harmless. See how small it is. Look at its gentle movements. It eats only insects. It helps our garden by keeping pests away. It wants nothing to do with humans. It's more afraid of you than you are of it. But Kyo wouldn't listen. His fear was too great, too consuming. The rational words his grandfather spoke couldn't penetrate the wall of terror that the very idea of the snake created in his mind. Logic had no power over the fear that gripped him. But snakes are dangerous, Kyo would insist. Everyone knows that. They bite people. They're scary. I don't want to go in the garden anymore. Hideaki was concerned. The boy's fear was keeping him from enjoying the garden, from helping with the vegetables, from the simple pleasure of being outdoors. The fear was limiting his life in ways that had nothing to do with actual danger. One late afternoon, Kyo was alone in the garden, sent by his mother to pick some tomatoes for dinner. He was moving carefully, nervously, constantly scanning the ground for any sign of the snake. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the garden path. Then he saw it. Something moving on the ground ahead of him. The shape was long and sinuous, definitely a snake. And this one was enormous, far larger than the small garden snake he had seen before. It must be a different snake, a dangerous one. The creature was at least as thick as his arm, maybe 6 or 7 feet long, moving slowly across the path. Terror seized Kyo completely. His legs locked. His breath stopped. His heart hammered so hard he could hear it in his ears. He couldn't scream, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stare at this enormous serpent that was right in his path, blocking his way back to the house. The snake moved with a sinuous, menacing motion. Its body seemed to pulse and writhe. Kyo could see every detail of its threatening form, the dark color, the massive size, the way it seemed to be looking right at him, even though he couldn't see its head clearly. He stood there frozen, convinced he was about to be attacked, about to be bitten by this monster that had invaded his grandfather's garden. Minutes passed like hours. The snake continued its slow movement across the path, and Kyo remained paralyzed, watching it, unable to run or call for help. Finally, his grandfather came out of the house, having noticed that Kyo had been gone too long for such a simple errand. He found his grandson standing rigid with fear in the middle of the garden path, staring at the ground with eyes wide and face pale. "Kyo!" "What's wrong?" Hideaki called out, hurrying toward the boy. "A giant snake!" Kyo gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Right there! Look how huge it is! Grandfather, be careful!" Hideaki looked where his grandson was pointing. He saw the small garden snake, the same one that had lived there for years, sunning itself on the path, as it often did in the late afternoon. It was no bigger than it had ever been, perhaps 8 inches long, completely harmless. And nearby, stretching across the path in the low-angled light of the setting sun, he saw the snake's shadow. The shadow was indeed enormous, at least 6 feet long and thick, cast long and dark by the horizontal rays of the sun. The shadow looked menacing, serpentine, threatening. But it was just a shadow. Hideaki understood immediately what had happened. His grandson had seen the shadow and thought it was the snake, or thought it was a different, much larger snake. The boy's fear had locked onto the shadow and convinced him that he was seeing a genuine threat. "Kyo," Hideaki said gently, "come here. Come stand next to me." But Kyo couldn't move. I can't. The snake is in the way. It's huge, grandfather. It's dangerous. Trust me, Hideaki said, his voice calm and steady. Take my hand. I promise you're safe. Slowly, with trembling steps, Kyo moved toward his grandfather, keeping his eyes on the enormous snake the entire time, certain it would strike at any moment. Hideaki took his grandson's hand and led him closer to where the small garden snake lay on the path. As they approached, something remarkable happened. The shadow shortened. The closer they got, the smaller the shadow became. By the time they stood right next to the actual snake, which quickly slithered away into the vegetables, startled by their approach, the shadow was appropriately small, no more threatening than the creature that cast it. Kyo stared at where the snake had been, then at where its shadow had stretched across the path. His breathing was still rapid, his heart still pounding, but confusion was beginning to replace terror. The shadow, he whispered. I thought the shadow was the snake, or a different snake, a huge one. I know, Hideaki said, kneeling down beside his grandson. Come, let me show you something. He picked up a stick from the ground, about the same size as the garden snake. In the low afternoon sun, he held it at different angles, casting its shadow on the path. When he held it close to the ground, the shadow was small. But when he held it higher, angled toward the sun, the shadow grew enormous, stretching across the entire path. See, Hideaki said, any small thing can cast a large shadow under the right conditions. The shadow tells you nothing about the actual size or danger of the thing. It just tells you about the light and the angle and your position relative to it. Kyo watched, fascinated despite his lingering fear, as his grandfather made the stick's shadow grow and shrink, made it look threatening or harmless just by changing the angle. The snake didn't change, Hideaki continued. It was always small and harmless. But the shadow changed based on the light, and you saw the shadow and thought it was showing you the truth about the snake. But shadows can lie, or rather, shadows can exaggerate. They can make something small look huge, something harmless look dangerous. He set down the stick and took both of Kyo's hands. This is what fear does, grandson. Fear is like that low sun. It casts everything in shadow, making it look bigger and more dangerous than it actually is. The snake didn't change. Your perception of it changed based on angle, light, and most importantly, based on your expectation of danger. Over the following days, Hideaki worked with Kyo to help him understand not just the snake's shadow, but the nature of fear itself. He showed him how fear distorts perception, how it takes small threats and makes them seem enormous, how it turns harmless things into monsters. They did experiments together. In the late afternoon, when the sun was low, they would put various objects on the path and observe their shadows. A small toy mouse cast a shadow that looked like a large rat. A thin branch cast a shadow that looked like a serpent. A butterfly landing on a stone cast a shadow that seemed to flutter and pulse menacingly. Everything looks more threatening in shadow, Hideaki explained. And fear puts everything in shadow. When you're afraid, your mind sees threats everywhere. It exaggerates the size of dangers. It interprets ambiguous things as dangerous. It casts everything in the worst possible light. just like this low sun casts everything in exaggerated shadow. Kyo was beginning to understand. So when I'm afraid, I see shadows instead of real things. Exactly, his grandfather said. The fear came first, from the stories you heard, from the ideas you had about snakes being dangerous. Then, because you were already afraid, when you saw something that could be a snake, your fear made it look as threatening as possible. The shadow confirmed what you already feared. But it wasn't showing you reality, it was showing you your fear. They began a daily practice. Each afternoon, when the shadows were long, Kyo would go into the garden with his grandfather. They would look for the snake, and when they found it, they would observe both the snake and its shadow. Kyo would practice seeing them as separate things. The actual snake, small and harmless, and the shadow, which could be large or small depending on the light and angle. Slowly, over weeks, Kyo's fear began to diminish. He learned to check his first perception. When something looked threatening, he would ask himself, am I seeing the thing itself, or am I seeing its shadow? Am I responding to actual danger, or to fear's distortion of reality? One day, Kyo was in the garden alone when he saw the snake. His first impulse was still fear, that instant clench of his heart, that flash of terror. But now, he had tools to work with that fear. He stopped, took a breath, and looked more carefully. The snake was small, as it had always been. It was moving slowly through the lettuce, eating small insects. Its shadow in the bright midday sun was tiny and non-threatening. There was nothing here to fear. The actual snake was harmless. The shadow his fear had been casting was the real threat. Kyo didn't run. He watched the snake for several minutes, observing its gentle movements, the way it went about its business without any attention to him. He felt his fear dissolving, replaced by curiosity, and even a kind of appreciation. This creature was part of the garden's ecosystem, helpful and harmless. When he told his grandfather about this encounter, Hideaki smiled with deep satisfaction. "You've learned something that will serve you far beyond this garden," he said. "You've learned to distinguish between actual threats and the shadows that fear casts. Most of what frightens us in life is shadows, not substance." As Kyo grew older, he found this lesson applied to many areas of his life. When he was worried about starting at a new school, he recognized that his fear was casting shadows, making the unknown seem more threatening than it actually was. When he was anxious about speaking in front of his class, he understood that his imagination was creating enormous shadows of embarrassment and failure that were far larger than any actual consequence. He learned to ask himself the questions his grandfather had taught him. What is the actual thing I'm afraid of? How big is it really? And how much of what I'm seeing is the shadow cast by my own fear? Years later, when Kyo was a young man, he returned to his grandfather's garden. The old snake had long since died, but its descendants still lived there, keeping the garden healthy. Kyo could watch them without fear, even appreciate their elegant movements and their important role in the garden's balance. A neighbor's child was visiting, a little girl who was terrified of the snakes. She screamed when she saw one, just as Kyo had done years before. And Kyo found himself repeating his grandfather's lesson, showing her how the afternoon sun cast long shadows, demonstrating how fear make small things look huge. The shadow is not the thing, he told her, using the same words his grandfather had used with him. Your fear shows you shadows and tells you they're real. But if you look more carefully, if you change your angle, if you step closer, you'll see the actual thing is much smaller than its shadow suggests. He showed her the small snake, harmless and gentle, and then its exaggerated shadow in the late afternoon light. He helped her understand that she had been responding to the shadow of her own fear, not to any actual danger. Hideaki, now very old, watched this teaching being passed down and felt deep satisfaction. This was wisdom that could transform a life. The understanding that fear distorts perception, that we so often respond to shadows rather than reality, that most of what terrifies us is an exaggeration created by our own minds. One evening, Hideaki and Kyo sat together in the garden as the sun set, casting long shadows across everything. "You know," Hideaki said, "I've been thinking about this teaching we've shared, about snakes and shadows. It goes even deeper than I first realized." "How so?" Kyo asked. "Well, we talk about how fear creates shadows that make things look bigger than they are. But there's another side to it. Sometimes we need to see our own shadows, the parts of ourselves we're afraid of or ashamed of. We spend so much energy trying to hide our shadows, pretending they don't exist, that we never really look at them. And anything we refuse to look at has power over us." He pointed to their own shadows, stretched long in the setting sun. Your shadow is part of you. You can't separate from it, but it's not you. It's just the outline you cast, the space you block from the light. The same is true of our inner shadows, our fears and flaws, and the parts of ourselves we don't want to acknowledge. They're part of us, but they're not all of us, and they only look monstrous when we refuse to look at them directly. Kyo thought about this. So, the lesson works both ways? Don't be afraid of shadows outside you because they're not as dangerous as they look. But also, don't be afraid of shadows inside you because they're just aspects of yourself, not monsters. Exactly, Hideaki said. Fear makes everything look worse than it is, whether it's a snake in the garden or a flaw in your own character. The solution is the same. Look directly at the thing itself, not at the shadow your fear is casting. When you look directly, with courage and honesty, you almost always find that the reality is more manageable than the shadow suggested. As night fell and the shadows merged into general darkness, Kyo reflected on all he had learned from one small garden snake and its shadow. The lesson had grown and deepened over the years, revealing new layers of meaning. What had started as a child's fear of a harmless creature had become a profound understanding about the nature of fear itself, about perception and reality, about how our minds create the very threats we're most afraid of. The garden snake, living its simple life among the vegetables, had been an unlikely teacher. But then Kyo had learned the best teachers often come in unexpected forms. Sometimes wisdom arrives not through grand revelations, but through small moments of noticing, through paying attention to shadows and light, through an old grandfather's patient guidance, and a child's eventual willingness to look more closely at what he feared. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what shadows you've been seeing. What fears in your life are casting exaggerated shadows, making things seem more threatening than they actually are. What worries have you been responding to as if they were huge and dangerous, when they might be quite small if you looked at them directly? Fear has a way of taking the unknown, the uncertain, the potentially difficult, and casting it in the worst possible light. Every ambiguous situation becomes threatening. Every challenge looks insurmountable. Every risk seems catastrophic. But these are shadows, distortions created by the angle of your perception and the intensity of your fear. What if you could see your fears in bright midday light instead of the exaggerated shadows of anxiety? What if you stepped closer to examine them, the way Kyo learned to approach the snake instead of running from it? You might find that the actual thing is much smaller, much less threatening than the shadow suggested. And what about the shadows within you? The parts of yourself you judge harshly, the flaws you try to hide, the aspects of your personality or your history that you're ashamed of. These cast shadows too. They look monstrous when you refuse to look at them, when you let fear tell you how terrible they are. But when you turn toward them with courage, when you examine them directly instead of avoiding them, you often find they're just human, just part of being alive, just aspects of yourself that need acknowledgement, not judgment. Rest now in the understanding that most of what frightens you is shadow, not substance. Your fears are real, yes. But what you fear is often an exaggeration, a distortion, an illusion created by poor lighting and unfortunate angles. The actual challenges you face are manageable. The real you beneath all the shadows is capable and whole. The darkness you're afraid of is just the absence of light, and light returns with each morning. Let your fears cast their shadows if they must. You don't have to fight them or deny them. Just recognize them for what they are, shadows, not the things themselves. And know that shadows, no matter how large or dark or menacing they appear, cannot hurt you. They're just shapes in the absence of light. They have no substance. They cannot touch you. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that the monsters are shadows, and the shadows will shrink when you bring them into the light of honest attention. You are not your fears. You are not the shadows those fears cast. You are the awareness that can see both the thing and its shadow, that can distinguish between actual danger and exaggerated perception, that can step closer and discover again and again that what looked huge from a distance is quite small up close. Rest in this truth. The garden snake is just a small creature that eats insects. The shadow was just a shadow. And you are safe. You've always been safe. The threat was never as large as it looked. It never is. As our exploration of Zen Buddhism deepens, let us listen to a story that reveals how true worth is often overlooked. Here starts the next story. In a rice field, at the edge of a village, there stood a scarecrow that the farmer had erected to keep birds away from his crops. The scarecrow stood perfectly still, day after day, doing nothing but being present in the field. Its arms were outstretched, its simple face looked out over the growing rice, and it never moved from its position. A merchant named Kazuo would pass this field every day on his way to town. Each time he saw the scarecrow, he felt a strange mixture of emotions. Sometimes he felt pity for it, standing there uselessly. Sometimes he felt contempt, thinking what a waste it was to occupy space without doing anything. Sometimes he felt anxious, as if the scarecrow's stillness was somehow judging his own constant busyness. One day, Kazuo stopped and spoke to the scarecrow, though he felt foolish doing so. "You just stand there," he said. "You don't move, you don't work, you don't accomplish anything." What kind of existence is that? A Zen monk named Hakuin happened to be walking past and overheard this one-sided conversation. He approached Kazuo with a smile. "You think the scarecrow does nothing?" Hakuin asked. "It just stands there," Kazuo replied, embarrassed to have been caught talking to a scarecrow. "It accomplishes nothing." "Does it keep birds from eating the rice?" Hakuin asked. "Well, yes, I suppose that's its purpose." "And does it accomplish this purpose by running around, flailing, working hard, being busy?" Kazuo looked at the scarecrow more carefully. "No. It accomplishes it by simply being present, by standing still." "Then it accomplishes everything necessary without appearing to do anything at all," Hakuin said. "This is Wu Wei, action through non-action, accomplishment through presence rather than busy effort." He gestured to the scarecrow. "Look at it. It doesn't worry about whether it's being productive enough. It doesn't stress about its purpose or question its worth. It doesn't compare itself to other scarecrows or feel inadequate. It simply stands, perfectly still, completely present, and in that stillness, it fulfills its function perfectly." Kazuo was quiet, thinking. He realized that he spent his entire life in constant motion, constant busyness, constantly trying to justify his existence through activity and accomplishment. He never allowed himself to simply be still without feeling guilty or anxious about it. "But I'm not a scarecrow," Kazuo protested. "I have things to do, responsibilities, work that requires effort." "Of course," Hakuin agreed. "But do you ever allow yourself to be still without justifying the stillness? Can you ever simply be present without needing to accomplish something, without needing to prove your worth through constant activity?" Kazuo couldn't answer. He realized he couldn't remember the last time he had been truly still without feeling that he was wasting time or being lazy. Hakuin continued. "The scarecrow teaches that sometimes presence itself is the action. Sometimes stillness accomplishes what busyness cannot. Sometimes the greatest wisdom is knowing when to stand perfectly still and let your simple presence be enough." Over the following weeks, Kazuo would stop by the scarecrow regularly. He began to practice standing still beside it, at first for just a minute, then longer. He found it incredibly difficult. His mind would flood with lists of things he should be doing. He would feel guilty for standing idle. He would worry about being seen as lazy. But gradually, he learned what the scarecrow knew: that stillness has its own value, that presence needs no justification, that sometimes the most profound action is no action at all. One day, as Kazuo stood in perfect stillness beside the scarecrow, the farmer approached him. "What are you doing?" the farmer asked. Kazuo smiled. "Learning from your scarecrow. Learning that I don't need to justify my existence through constant motion. Learning that presence itself is sometimes enough." The farmer laughed. "That scarecrow has taught many people. It stands there doing nothing, and yet it teaches more than many teachers who never stop talking. Tonight, as you rest, you can be like the scarecrow. You don't need to justify this stillness. You don't need to be accomplishing something every moment. You don't need to prove your worth through constant activity. Simply being here, present and still, is enough, more than enough. Your presence itself has value. Your stillness serves a purpose, even when it appears to do nothing. Rest without guilt. Be still without anxiety. Stand like the scarecrow in the field of your own life. And let your simple presence be the action that's needed. In a famous garden known for its roses, there appeared one season a strange mutation, a rosebush with no thorns. The stems were completely smooth, the flowers beautiful, but there was no defense, no sharp points to protect the plant from being damaged. The gardener, a woman named Ayame, was fascinated by this thornless rose. She thought it was perfect, an improvement over regular roses. Who wouldn't want roses without thorns? Roses that you could handle freely, cut without care, and arrange without risk of being pricked. She took cuttings from the thornless rose and propagated them, creating a whole section of the garden filled with these defenseless plants. She was so proud of this achievement that she invited people from across the region to see her thornless roses. But within a few months, problems appeared. Deer, which usually avoided the thorny roses, ate the thornless ones freely. Insects that were discouraged by thorns colonized these plants without resistance. Careless visitors would grab handfuls of flowers, taking far more than they would have if thorns had made them cautious. Within a year, the thornless roses were struggling. They required constant human protection, constant intervention, constant care in ways that regular roses never needed. What had seemed like an improvement turned out to be a vulnerability, a visiting botanist explained to Ayame. The thorns weren't a flaw in the design. They were part of the wisdom of the design. The rose needs protection because it's beautiful and therefore desirable. The thorns say, "Appreciate me from a respectful distance. If you want my beauty, approach carefully with awareness. Without that protection, the rose is too vulnerable to survive." Ayame was defensive at first, but thorns hurt people. Wouldn't it be better to have roses without danger? Danger isn't the only reason for boundaries, the botanist replied. The thorns create an appropriate relationship. They don't prevent you from enjoying the rose. They just require you to be careful, to pay attention, to approach with awareness rather than grabbing carelessly. The thornless rose invites carelessness, and carelessness destroys it. Ayame began to see the thornless roses differently. What she had thought was an improvement was actually a mutation that made the plant unable to protect itself. And that inability to protect itself meant the plant couldn't thrive. She noticed similar patterns in human behavior. People who had no boundaries, no ability to say no, no thorns to protect themselves, often ended up depleted and taken advantage of. Like her thornless roses, they needed constant intervention to survive because they couldn't protect themselves naturally. "The thorns aren't cruel," she told visitors who still admired the thornless roses. "They're wisdom. They're the rose's way of teaching appropriate relationships. Approach with care. Take only what's offered. Respect the boundary between appreciation and consumption. The thornless rose can't teach this lesson, so it gets consumed." She stopped propagating the thornless mutation and let those plants live out their natural lifespan while caring for them extra carefully. When they eventually died, she didn't replace them. Her garden returned to thorny roses that could protect themselves. that invited careful appreciation rather than careless grabbing. Tonight, you might consider your own thorns, the boundaries you felt guilty about, the protections you've thought were unfriendly or unkind, the ways you've learned to say no, to keep an appropriate distance, to require others to approach you with care rather than carelessness. These aren't flaws, they're wisdom. They're what allow you to survive and thrive. Don't apologize for your thorns. They're part of your design, protecting what's most beautiful about you from being carelessly destroyed. Continuing along the path of Zen insight, we pause now to hear a teaching about perception and hidden value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a valley between two mountain ranges, there was a river that confused everyone who saw it. Most rivers in the region flowed from high elevations to low, following gravity as rivers should. But this river appeared to run uphill, flowing from what looked like lower ground to higher ground, defying logic and nature. Villagers argued about the river for generations. Some said it was cursed, that supernatural forces made it run backwards. Others insisted it was an optical illusion, that the river only appeared to run uphill but actually didn't. A few claimed the river was evidence of magic in the world, proof that natural laws could be suspended. A scholar named Fumiko came to study the peculiar river. She was a woman who trusted observation over superstition, who believed that understanding came from careful study rather than easy assumptions. She spent weeks walking the river's length, taking measurements, making careful notes. What she discovered was unexpected. The river wasn't running uphill at all, though it certainly appeared to be. The optical illusion was created by the unusual topology of the valley. The way surrounding hills created a visual context that made lower ground appear higher and higher ground appear lower. When you adjusted for this visual distortion and looked at actual elevations, the river was flowing downhill as it should, following gravity perfectly. But there was a second discovery, more interesting than the first. There was a short section where the river actually did flow uphill, pushed by an underground spring with such force that it created a brief reversal of normal flow before gravity took over again. This wasn't magic or curse, it was hydrology, underground pressure overcoming gravity temporarily, a natural phenomenon that looked miraculous only because people didn't understand the forces involved. Fumiko shared her findings with the villagers, explaining the optical illusion and the underground spring. Some villagers were relieved to have the mystery explained. Others were disappointed. They had preferred the magical explanation to the scientific one. But an old farmer named Gonji said something that made Fumiko reconsider what she thought she'd discovered. "The river teaches something important," Gonji said. "It teaches that things can look completely wrong while being completely right, that what appears to violate natural laws might just be responding to forces we don't understand yet." He pointed to his fields. "I plant crops that other farmers say won't grow in this soil. They say I'm working against nature, that I should plant what everyone plants. But I've learned that this soil has properties they don't understand, that what looks like wrong farming is actually right farming for these specific conditions." Fumiko thought about this. She had explained the river's apparent backwards flow, but Gonji was suggesting something deeper, that the river taught people to question their assumptions about what's natural, what's possible, what's right. The river looked wrong, but was responding perfectly to actual conditions, both the optical conditions that made flow appear backwards and the geological conditions that briefly pushed water uphill. "You're saying the river teaches us to look deeper before judging?" Fumiko asked. "More than that," Gonji replied. "It teaches us that backwards and forwards depend on what forces you're aware of. To someone who only knows gravity, water flowing uphill is impossible, wrong, against nature. But to someone who understands underground pressure, water flowing uphill is perfectly natural, a correct response to present forces." He gestured to the river. "How many things in life look wrong because we're only seeing some of the forces involved? How many people are judged for going against the flow when they're actually responding to forces others can't see?" Over the following months, Fumiko expanded her study. She began collecting stories of things that appeared to violate natural expectations, but actually didn't. They just responded to forces that weren't immediately obvious. A tree growing bent at a strange angle because of prevailing winds that had since died down. A flower blooming in winter because of an underground hot spring. A bird flying inland before storms because it sensed pressure changes humans couldn't detect. Each example taught the same lesson. What appears wrong might be responding perfectly to reality, while what appears right might be ignorant of important forces. A young mother came to Fumiko with a problem. "My son won't follow the path I've set for him. He's going backwards from where he should go, against everything natural and right. How do I make him flow the right direction?" "Tell me about your son," Fumiko said. The mother described a boy who refused to take over the family business, who wanted instead to become a traveling musician. "It's backwards," she insisted. "Children should continue family work. That's the natural flow. He's going against nature." "Or he's responding to forces you're not seeing," Fumiko suggested gently. "Is he talented musically?" "Very, but that's not the point. Talent doesn't change duty." "Doesn't it?" Fumiko asked. "The river appears to flow backwards because of forces beneath the surface. Perhaps your son is flowing in a direction that looks backwards to you, but is actually responding to forces inside him, talents, passions, purposes that you can't see or don't value. Just because his flow doesn't match your expectations doesn't mean it's wrong." She told the mother about the river, about how it appeared to defy nature, but actually followed it perfectly when all forces were considered. "Your son might be like that river. What looks like backwards rebellion might be forward movement towards something he's meant to do. The question isn't whether he's flowing the way you expected, but whether he's flowing true to himself." This conversation troubled the mother, but she began to observe her son differently. She noticed how music seemed to flow from him naturally, how he came alive when playing, how his path, though different from hers, had its own rightness to it. Eventually, though it was difficult, she accepted that his backwards path might be his right path. Word spread about Fumiko's teachings about the backwards river. People began using it as a way to reconsider their own judgments. When someone's path looked wrong, they would ask, "Am I seeing all the forces involved? Or am I judging based on incomplete understanding?" A magistrate applied this thinking to a legal case. A man had broken a law. But when the magistrate investigated deeper, he found forces that explained the law-breaking in a way that changed the judgment entirely. The man wasn't defying order. He was responding to a greater order that the law itself hadn't anticipated. A teacher applied it to a student who learned differently from others. Instead of judging the student as backwards or wrong, the teacher looked for the forces, the different cognitive patterns, the unique intelligences that made the student's apparently backwards approach actually forward for him. Years later, Fumiko's study of the backwards river had become famous beyond the valley. She was invited to give lectures, to advise rulers, to teach scholars. But she always returned to the river itself, watching its apparently impossible flow, using it to remind herself that understanding requires humility, that what appears wrong might be right in ways she hasn't yet grasped. A visiting philosopher asked her, "But aren't some things actually wrong? Doesn't your river teaching lead to excusing everything, to saying nothing is really backwards because we just don't understand the forces?" "No," Fumiko replied carefully. "Some things are genuinely wrong. They're responding to destructive forces like cruelty or ignorance or selfishness. The river teaches discernment, not relativism. It teaches us to look for forces we might not see before judging, but after looking, we still make judgments. The difference is, our judgments are informed by deeper understanding rather than surface appearance." She pointed to the river. "This river looks backwards, but isn't. But if a farmer tried to make his irrigation flow uphill without underground spring pressure, that would be genuinely backwards, genuinely wrong. The teaching isn't that everything is right. The teaching is that apparent wrongness requires investigation before judgment. Some backwards flows are responding to forces we need to understand. Others are just backwards." Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider things in your life that appear backwards or wrong. Your own path that doesn't match expectations. Other people's choices that confuse you. Circumstances that seem to violate how things should be. Before judging these as wrong, ask, what forces might I not be seeing? What underground pressures might be pushing flow in directions that look impossible, but are actually perfectly natural? The backwards river teaches humility in judgment, curiosity before conclusion, openness to forces you don't yet understand. Not everything that looks wrong is right, but some things that look wrong are responding to reality more accurately than things that look right. The only way to know is to look deeper, to consider forces beyond the obvious, to remain humble about the limits of your understanding. Rest now in acceptance of apparent backwards flows in yourself and others. Let the river run its course, responding to all the forces acting on it, both visible and hidden. Trust that what looks impossible might be possible, that what seems backwards might be forward, that nature is wiser than our quick judgments about what's natural. The river knows where it's going, even when it appears to go the wrong way. As we drift deeper into the still waters of Zen, a quiet teaching begins to rise, one that speaks of clarity and of value not always seen. Listen gently now. The next story begins. In a mountain monastery lived an old abbess named Ren, who kept in her private chamber an unusual mirror. The mirror was ancient, its surface darkened and worn until it reflected almost nothing. Visitors who saw it would often remark on its uselessness. "Your mirror shows nothing," they would say. Why keep it? Get a new one that actually works. But Ren treasured this mirror and looked into it every morning. It shows me exactly what I need to see, she would reply, though she never explained what she meant. One day, a vain young woman named Ayame came to the monastery seeking spiritual guidance. She was beautiful and knew it, spending hours each day on her appearance, constantly checking her reflection in every available surface. Her identity was completely wrapped up in her looks. During her first meeting with Ren, Ayame couldn't stop glancing at the darkened mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of herself. But the mirror showed nothing, just a dark, murky surface with barely a hint of reflection. "Your mirror is broken," Ayame said with annoyance. "Don't you want to see yourself?" "I see myself perfectly well in this mirror," Ren replied. "What do you see?" "Nothing. It's too dark." "Exactly," Ren said, and smiled. Ayame didn't understand, but as the days passed and she continued her stay at the monastery, she found herself repeatedly drawn to Ren's useless mirror. She would stand before it, searching for her reflection, finding almost nothing. It was deeply unsettling. Every other mirror showed her who she was, or at least showed her what she looked like. This mirror showed nothing. After a week, Ayame mentioned her frustration to Ren. "I hate your mirror. I keep looking into it hoping to see myself, but there's nothing there." "And what does that nothing teach you?" Ren asked. "That the mirror is broken." "Or that you're looking for the wrong thing," Ren suggested. "Every mirror you've ever looked into has shown you your face, your hair, your features. You've spent years studying that reflection, knowing exactly what you look like. My mirror can't show you that, so it forces you to consider, if you can't see your face, what else might you see? If appearance isn't available, what remains?" Ayame thought about this. When she looked into normal mirrors, she saw features she judged. Eyes too small, nose too sharp, skin not smooth enough. She saw an image she tried to perfect, control, improve. The looking was never really seeing. It was evaluating, criticizing, trying to manage how others would perceive her. But in Ren's dark mirror, there was nothing to evaluate, no features to judge, no appearance to control. Just dark surface and, if she looked very carefully, the barest hint of a form. Not details, just presence. "What do you see when you look in your mirror?" Ayame asked Ren. "Nothing that can be improved or criticized," Ren replied. "Nothing that age can diminish or beauty can enhance. Just the simple fact of being here, looking. The mirror that shows everything tempts you to judge what you see. The mirror that shows nothing releases you from judgment." She came to stand beside Ayame before the dark mirror. "Look at us now, standing here together. Can you see our faces?" "Barely," Ayame admitted. "Can you tell which of us is more beautiful?" "No." "Can you see our ages, our features, the details that usually define us?" "No." "Then we stand equal before this mirror," Ren said. "Not as beautiful or plain, young or old, but simply as two beings, present in this moment. The mirror that shows nothing strips away all the superficial ways we distinguish ourselves and leaves only the essential fact: we are here." Over the following weeks, Ayame found herself looking into Ren's mirror more than any of the clear mirrors in the monastery. At first, this puzzled her. Why would she choose the mirror that showed nothing? But gradually she understood. She was tired of the constant judgment that came with seeing her reflection clearly. Tired of always evaluating, always trying to improve, always wondering if she looked acceptable. The dark mirror gave her relief from all that. It let her be present without being perceived, even by herself. It let her exist without the burden of appearance. "I think I'm beginning to understand," Ayame told Ren one morning. "The mirror that shows nothing is actually showing me something very important. That I exist independent of how I look. That there's a me underneath or beyond appearance. I've spent so many years focused on my reflection that I forgot there's someone doing the looking." Ren nodded with satisfaction. The mirror that shows everything directs your attention outward, to surface and appearance. The mirror that shows nothing directs your attention inward, to the awareness that's looking. One mirror shows you an object to be evaluated. The other mirror reveals you as a subject who is aware. She touched the darkened surface gently. Most people think a mirror's value is in how clearly it reflects. But sometimes a mirror's greatest value is in what it doesn't show. The absence of reflection can teach what the presence of reflection never could. Ayame stayed at the monastery for 6 months, and during that time, her relationship with mirrors changed completely. She no longer felt compelled to check her reflection constantly. When she did look in clear mirrors, she no longer saw an image to be judged, but simply a face, no more or less significant than any other face. "Your dark mirror freed me," she told Ren when she prepared to leave. "I thought I needed to see myself clearly to know who I was, but actually, seeing myself clearly kept me trapped in appearance, in judgment, in the endless work of managing how I looked. Your mirror that showed nothing helped me discover the me that exists beyond appearance." After Ayame left, other students asked Ren about the mirror's teaching. "Why not just remove all mirrors?" one asked. "If the point is to free people from attachment to appearance, why have mirrors at all?" "Because running from mirrors is still being controlled by them," Ren explained. "The person who avoids all mirrors is as attached to appearance as the person who constantly looks. They're just attached to not looking rather than to looking. The dark mirror teaches something different. It teaches how to look without judgment, how to be aware of appearance without being enslaved by it." She held up the darkened mirror for the students to see. "This mirror shows that appearance and essence are not the same. The clear mirror shows you appearance so clearly that you might mistake it for essence. This dark mirror removes appearance and asks, what remains? What are you when you can't see your face? That question leads to wisdom." A philosophical student asked, "But isn't the dark mirror just another form of illusion? It hides reality rather than revealing it." "Does it?" Ren replied. "The clear mirror shows you how light reflects off your features at this particular moment from this particular angle. Is that reality? Or is that also just one kind of information, one kind of seeing? The dark mirror shows you something the clear mirror can't. Your existence independent of your reflection. Both mirrors have their uses. The question is whether you're wise enough to learn from each what it has to teach." Years later, when Ren was dying, she gave the darkened mirror to her successor with specific instructions. "Keep this mirror even though students will mock it, even though visitors will offer to replace it. This mirror teaches what cannot be taught in words, that sometimes absence reveals more than presence, that sometimes nothing shows more than everything, that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from what we cannot see rather than from what we can. Tonight, as you rest, you might imagine looking into a mirror that shows nothing, not because the mirror is broken, but because it's teaching you something that clear mirrors never could. Without your reflection to evaluate and judge, what remains? Without your appearance to manage and improve, who are you? The mirror that shows nothing is inviting you to meet yourself beyond surface, beyond image, beyond all the ways you've learned to see yourself through others' eyes. In the dark mirror, there's just presence, just awareness, just the simple fact of being here without needing to look any particular way. Rest now in the dark mirror's teaching. Let yourself be unseen, unreflected, undefined by appearance. Let yourself exist in the space beyond image, where judgment can't reach, where evaluation has no meaning, where you simply are without needing to be any particular way. The mirror shows nothing, and in that nothing, everything essential is revealed. Sleep in that revelation tonight. In a monastery, there was a meditation hall with a heavy wooden door that was always kept closed during practice sessions. The door had no lock, but everyone treated it as if it were locked, entering only at designated times and never leaving during meditation periods. A visiting monk named Gensho noticed this and asked why no one ever left during meditation, even though the door was clearly unlocked. It wouldn't be proper, one monk explained. During practice time, we stay in practice. Leaving would break the container, would disturb others, would show a lack of discipline. But you could leave if you wanted to, Gensho asked. Technically, yes, but we don't. Gensho found this fascinating. These monks were living as if imprisoned during meditation sessions, but the prison existed only in their minds. The door was open. They could leave any time, yet they sat as if bound. He began to notice similar patterns throughout the monastery. People living within invisible constraints, following rules that had no enforcement mechanism, restricting themselves to prisons that had no walls. One day, during a particularly long meditation session, Gensho stood up, walked to the door, opened it, stepped outside into the sunlight, and then walked back in and sat down. The other monks were shocked by this violation of protocol. Afterward, the abbot called Gensho to his chambers. "Why did you leave during meditation?" "To see if I could," Gensho replied, "to test whether the constraint was real or imagined." It was imagined. The door was never locked. I was never actually trapped. I was sitting there by choice, not by compulsion. "But we all know we could leave," the abbot said. "The point is that we choose not to." "Do you really know that?" Gensho asked. "Or have you assumed for so long that you shouldn't leave that you've forgotten you have a choice? There's a difference between staying by conscious choice and staying by habit or assumed constraint. One is freedom. The other is just a comfortable prison." This question disturbed many monks. They began to realize they had been treating many choices as if they were requirements. They had been living within restrictions that no one was actually enforcing. They had imprisoned themselves with beliefs about what they should or shouldn't do. The abbot considered Gensho's point carefully. "You're right," he admitted. "We've been treating the open door as if it were locked. We've been prisoners of our own assumptions. But what do we do with this awareness?" "First, acknowledge it," Gensho said. "See clearly that most of your constraints are chosen, not imposed. Then decide consciously, which constraints serve you? Which do you want to keep? And which are you maintaining out of habit or fear, not because they actually help you?" He gestured toward the meditation hall. "That door has always been open, but if you never test that, if you never actually check whether you could leave, then you're living as if imprisoned, even though you're free. True freedom begins with recognizing which prisons are real and which are imagined." Over the following weeks, the atmosphere in the monastery changed. Monks began questioning which rules actually served their practice and which they followed out of mere habit. They discovered they had internalized many restrictions that had no actual external enforcement. One monk realized he had been afraid to speak his honest opinions for years, not because speaking was forbidden, but because he had decided early on that it was safer to stay quiet. No one had actually silenced him. He had silenced himself. Another monk discovered he had been avoiding certain foods, not because of any monastic rule, but because he had once been told they were inappropriate for monks, and he had never questioned this. The restriction existed only in his belief. A third monk realized he had been limiting his meditation practice to certain times and places, not because practice was restricted to those times, but because he had created a mental rule about when and where meditation counted. "We've been living in prisons of our own making," one monk said during a group discussion. "The doors were open all along. We just never tried to walk through them." Gensho nodded. "Most people live this way. They believe they're trapped in circumstances, jobs, relationships, and patterns of behavior. They believe they have no choice. But often, if they examined closely, they'd discover the constraints are their own beliefs, not external reality. The door was never locked." The abbot asked, "But doesn't this lead to chaos? If everyone starts leaving meditation sessions whenever they want, ignoring the schedule, doing what they please, doesn't the structure fall apart?" "Possibly," Gensho agreed. "But structure maintained through unconscious compliance isn't real structure. It's just a habit pretending to be discipline. True structure comes from conscious choice. When people choose to stay, not because they believe they must, but because they genuinely want to, that's authentic practice. When they stay simply because they never questioned whether they could leave, that's just imprisonment with no walls." He looked around at the gathered monks. "I'm not suggesting you abandon all structure or discipline. I'm suggesting you own your choices. Recognize that you're staying because you choose to, not because you have to. Recognize that the door is open and you're free to leave, and then decide whether to stay or go based on authentic choice rather than assumed constraint." This teaching spread beyond the monastery. People in the nearby town heard about the open door and began examining their own lives. How many constraints were they living under that existed only in their minds? How many prisons had they created for themselves? A woman realized she had been staying in an unhappy marriage not because of any real obstacle to leaving, but because of stories she told herself about what leaving would mean. When she examined these stories, she found they were beliefs, not facts. The door had always been open. A man discovered he had been working at a job he hated for years, believing he had no choice, that his family responsibilities required it. When he looked honestly, he found there were other options he had never seriously considered, because he had assumed from the beginning that he was trapped. An elderly person recognized that many of the limitations they experienced weren't from age or circumstance, but from beliefs about what old people could or couldn't do. The constraints were largely self-imposed. The teaching of the open door, people began to say, is that most prisons are mental. We're free more often than we realize. The question isn't whether we can leave, but whether we've been living as if we can't. Years later, the monastery still practiced meditation with a closed door during sessions. But now there was a different quality to it. Everyone knew the door was unlocked. Everyone knew they could leave any time they chose. They stayed not from obligation or assumed constraint, but from authentic choice. The practice deepened because people were choosing it freely, rather than submitting to it from habit or fear. Gensho's simple act of walking out and back in had freed an entire community from invisible prisons, not by tearing down structure, but by revealing that structure maintained by genuine choice is stronger than structure maintained by unconscious compliance. Tonight, as you rest, you might examine the doors in your own life. Which ones do you believe are locked? Which constraints do you accept as unchangeable? What prisons are you living in that exist only in your beliefs? The door has always been open. You've always been freer than you realized. The constraints that feel so solid are often just habits of thought, beliefs you've never questioned, stories you've told yourself for so long that you mistake them for truth. You're not as trapped as you think. You have more choices than you've acknowledged. The prison is mostly mental, and mental prisons can be walked out of the moment you realize the door was never actually locked. This doesn't mean every choice is easy or without consequences, but it means you're choosing even when you believe you have no choice. And recognizing that you're choosing is the beginning of real freedom. Rest now in the understanding that you're freer than you knew. The door is open. It's always been open. You can stay or go based on authentic choice, not on assumed necessity. This recognition doesn't require you to change anything external. It just requires you to see clearly. The constraints you live under are more permeable than you thought. You've had more freedom all along. You just haven't been exercising it. Sleep now as a free person, aware that tomorrow you can walk through any open door you choose, or stay where you are by genuine choice, rather than imagined imprisonment. The freedom was always yours. Now you know it. With each breath, we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen, where the smallest stone may hold the greatest truth. Here starts the next story. In a village where strong winds frequently blew down from the mountains, there was a grove of trees that included many different species. There were tall, rigid pines that stood straight and proud. There were sturdy oaks with thick trunks and strong branches. And among these impressive trees, there grew a single weeping willow, whose branches hung down gracefully, swaying with every breeze. A young carpenter named Riku would come to this grove to select wood for his work. He admired the strong, straight pines and the solid oaks. These were trees that stood firm against the wind, that didn't bend or yield, that maintained their position no matter what the weather came. This, Riku thought, was what strength looked like. The The weeping willow he barely noticed, and when he did, he pitied it. Its branches drooped instead of reaching proudly skyward. It swayed and bent with every wind. It seemed weak, yielding, almost pathetic compared to the strong trees around it. Then one year, a great storm came. The wind howled down from the mountains with unprecedented force. The rain fell in sheets. Lightning split the sky. For 3 days and 3 nights, the storm raged. When it finally passed, Riku went to the grove to see what wood might be available from fallen trees. What he found shocked him. The strong pines, so tall and proud, had snapped like twigs. Their rigid trunks had broken under the force of the wind. The sturdy oaks had been uprooted, their strong but inflexible branches torn away. All across the grove lay the wreckage of trees that had stood firm, refused to yield, and had been destroyed for their rigidity. But the weeping willow still stood. Its branches, which had seemed so weak because they bent and swayed, had flexed with the wind rather than breaking against it. The tree that had appeared most fragile had survived when all the apparently strong trees had fallen. Riku sat beside the willow, looking at the destruction around it, trying to understand what he was seeing. Everything he thought he knew about strength was being challenged. The rig had broken. The yielding had survived. An old Buddhist nun named Kei was walking through the grove, surveying the damage from the storm. She saw Riku sitting in confusion and joined him. "The storm taught you something," she said. "I don't understand," Riku replied. "The strong trees broke. The weak ones survived. How can that be?" "You're confusing rigidity with strength," Kei said gently, "and flexibility with weakness. These are not the same things." She touched one of the willow's drooping branches. "This tree looks weak because it bends, but bending is what saved it." The rigid trees fought against the wind, trying to stand firm, refusing to yield. And the wind broke them. The willow didn't fight. It bent with the wind, yielded to forces it couldn't resist, and in that yielding, found the strength to survive. Riku listened carefully as Kei continued. "There's a principle in martial arts called Ju, which means gentleness or flexibility. The idea is that you don't meet force with force. You don't try to be harder than what's hitting you. Instead, you yield. You move with the energy coming at you. You redirect it rather than blocking it. This isn't a weakness. It's a different kind of strength." She gestured to the broken pines. These trees were strong in one way, but their strength was brittle. They could stand firm against normal winds, but when a force greater than their resistance came, they broke. The willow's strength is different. It has no brittleness because it has no rigidity. It can't break because it never stops bending. Over the following weeks, Riku began to see this principle everywhere. He watched how water, soft and yielding, could wear away stone over time. He noticed how the most rigid people in the village were often the most fragile when things didn't go their way. He observed how the people who could adapt and bend were often the ones who survived life's storms most intact. He changed his approach to carpentry. Instead of always seeking the hardest, most rigid woods, he began to appreciate woods with some flexibility, some give. He learned to work with the wood's natural tendencies rather than trying to force it into shapes it didn't want to take. His furniture became known for being both strong and graceful, able to bear weight while having a quality of flow and ease. But the deeper lesson was about how he lived his own life. Riku had always prided himself on being firm in his opinions, rigid in his principles, unwavering in his positions. He thought this made him strong, but he began to realize it made him brittle. When his wife suggested a different approach to something, his first instinct had always been to resist, to stand firm in his original idea. Now he began to consider, what if yielding wasn't losing? What if listening and adjusting weren't weaknesses but wisdom? When a client wanted changes to a piece he was building, instead of rigidly defending his design, he would flex, adapt, and incorporate their ideas. Often, the result was better than what he had planned. His yielding led to better outcomes than his resistance ever had. When life didn't go according to his plans, instead of fighting against reality, insisting things should be different, he began to bend with what was happening, to adapt, to find ways to work with circumstances rather than against them. A young man from the village came to Riku seeking advice. Everyone tells me I need to be strong, to stand firm, to never back down, but I don't feel strong when I do that. I feel brittle, like I'm about to break. Riku took him to see the weeping willow. The tree had grown even larger in the years since the storm, its graceful branches now spreading wide. This tree survived a storm that destroyed every tree around it, Riku said, not because it was harder or more rigid, but because it knew how to yield. Look at how it moves with this breeze. It doesn't fight the wind, it dances with it. He touched one of the branches, pulling it down and watching it spring back when he released it. True strength includes flexibility. The ability to bend without breaking, to yield without collapsing, to adapt without losing your essential nature. The willow yields, but it doesn't uproot. It bends, but it doesn't break. This is a strength that lasts. The young man asked, "But how do you know when to stand firm and when to bend? Don't some things require us to be rigid, to not yield?" "Yes," Riku acknowledged. "The willow has strong roots. It's flexible in its branches, but grounded in its foundation. The key is knowing what's essential and what's not. Your core values, your true nature, these are like the willow's roots. They ground you, but your opinions, your plans, your preferences, these can be like the branches. They can bend, adapt, yield without threatening who you fundamentally are." He gestured to where the oak and pine had once stood. These trees tried to keep everything rigid. Every branch, every position. They couldn't distinguish between what was essential to hold firm and what could be released. So when the great test came, they lost everything. The willow knew what to hold and what to release. It held its roots and released its branches to the wind. That's wisdom. Years later, the weeping willow became a teaching symbol in the village. Parents would bring children to see it, telling them the story of the great storm. Teachers would use it to illustrate the difference between rigidity and strength. Couples in conflict would sit beneath it, reminding themselves that yielding to each other wasn't losing, but creating a relationship that could weather storms. Riku, now an old man, would still visit the willow regularly. He had learned his lesson deeply. His life had brought many storms, many winds that could have broken him if he had stood rigid against them. But he had learned to bend, to yield, to move with forces he couldn't resist. And like the willow, he had survived, even thrived, not despite his flexibility, but because of it. One day, a master carpenter from the capital came to the village seeking Riku's advice. "I'm known for my rigid standards, my unwillingness to compromise," the master said. "But I'm miserable, and my relationships are all strained. People say I should learn from you." Riku took him to the willow. "What do you see?" "A tree with drooping branches. It looks weak." "It's the only tree that survived the great storm. Everything that looked strong broke. This tree that looks weak stood firm, not through rigidity, but through flexibility." He let this sink in before continuing. "Your rigidity feels like strength because you're in control, imposing your will, but it's actually brittleness. When life brings forces stronger than your will, you'll break. Learn to bend. Learn to yield. Not in your core principles, but in your attachment to having everything your way. True mastery includes knowing when to stand firm and when to flow." Tonight, as you rest, notice where you're holding rigid. What positions are you gripping too tightly? What plans are you clinging to that life is asking you to release? Where might you need to be more like the weeping willow, yielding to forces you can't control, bending so you don't break? Strength isn't always about standing firm. Sometimes it's about flowing with what comes. Sometimes the greatest power is in yielding, adapting, and moving with life, rather than against it. The willow survives because it doesn't fight battles it can't win. It bends, knowing that bending isn't breaking. Let yourself bend tonight. Let yourself yield to rest, to uncertainty, to whatever is. Don't be rigid in your expectations of how this should feel or what should happen. Flow like the willow's branches in the wind, trusting that your roots are strong enough to hold you even as you move with forces beyond your control. Yielding isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And tonight, it's the way to deep rest. In a coastal village where dangerous rocks lurked beneath the waves, there stood a lighthouse that had saved countless ships from destruction. The lighthouse keeper was a man named Tomo, who had tended the light faithfully for 20 years, never missing a night, never letting the beacon fail. Tomo took great pride in his work. Each evening as he lit the lamp, he would think about the ships that would see his light and know where the safe passage lay. He imagined grateful sailors steering clear of the rocks because of his vigilance. His purpose was clear, his contribution visible, his worth measured in ships that arrived safely rather than wrecking on the shore. But then came a period in Tomo's life when everything fell apart. His wife died after a long illness. His adult son, with whom he'd been close, moved to a distant city and rarely wrote. His closest friend in the village passed away suddenly. Within the span of 6 months, Tomo lost everyone who mattered most to him. He fell into a deep despair. He no longer felt the satisfaction he once had in his work. The lighthouse seemed meaningless, his life empty, his purpose hollow. He felt lost, as if he was stumbling through darkness with no light to guide him, no sense of direction, no hope that things would improve. Yet, despite his inner darkness, Tomo continued to light the lighthouse every night. It was a habit, a duty, the automatic continuation of what he had always done. But there was no joy in it anymore, no sense of meaning. He lit the lamp because that's what lighthouse keepers do. not because he felt it mattered. He would stand in the lamp room at night, watching the light sweep across the dark water and think, I'm supposed to be the one providing light, but I'm drowning in darkness. I'm supposed to guide others to safety, but I'm completely lost in myself. What right do I have to stand here pretending to know the way when I can't find my own path? One stormy night, as Tomo stood in the lamp room feeling particularly hopeless, there was a knock at the lighthouse door. He descended to find a sailor, soaking wet, nearly hypothermic, who had been thrown from his ship when a wave swept over the deck. I saw your light, the sailor gasped as Tomo pulled him inside. I was in the water, being pulled toward the rocks. I thought I was going to die. Then I saw your light, and I swam toward it. Your light saved my life. Tomo brought the man warm clothes, hot tea, and blankets. As the sailor recovered by the fire, he kept repeating his gratitude. If your light hadn't been there, I would have been smashed against the rocks. I couldn't see anything else, but I could see your light. It showed me which way to swim. After the sailor left the next morning, rescued by his ship, which had returned looking for him, Tomo sat for a long time thinking about what had happened. He had been so focused on his own inner darkness that he had forgotten what his light actually did. It didn't require him to feel enlightened. It didn't need him to be free of darkness himself. It just needed to shine. The sailor didn't care that the lighthouse keeper was lost and grieving. The sailor didn't need Tomo to have all the answers or to be living a perfect life. The sailor just needed the light to be there, marking the safe passage, showing where the dangers were. A Zen monk who lived at the village had heard about the rescued sailor. He came to visit Tomo at the lighthouse. I've noticed you've been struggling, the monk said gently. Since your losses, I see the darkness in you. Tomo nodded, too tired to pretend otherwise. I light this beacon every night, but I feel like a fraud. How can I guide others when I'm lost myself? How can I provide light when I'm full of darkness? The monk looked up at the lamp tower. Does the lighthouse need to understand navigation to be useful? Does it need to have sailed all the seas to show where the rocks are? Does it need to feel happy and fulfilled to save lives? No, Tomo admitted. It just needs to shine. Exactly, the monk said. You think your inner darkness disqualifies you from helping others, but actually, your willingness to keep the light burning despite your darkness makes your service even more valuable. You're not helping others because you have everything figured out. You're helping them because you do what needs to be done, regardless of how you feel. He touched Tomo's shoulder. Many people believe they can't help others until they're completely healed themselves. Until they've solved all their problems, found all their answers, achieved enlightenment or happiness or wholeness. But if everyone waited until they were completely well before helping others, no one would ever help anyone. We're all broken in some way. We're all stumbling in the darkness of one kind or another, but we can still hold lights for each other. Tomo felt something shift inside him. You're saying I can be lost and still guide others. You already are, the monk replied. You've been doing it every night. Your grief, your despair, your sense of being lost, none of that prevented the light from shining. None of that stopped you from doing what needed to be done. You think you're a fraud because you're suffering while helping others. But actually, You're demonstrating something important. Service doesn't require personal perfection. It requires showing up and doing what needs to be done. Over the following weeks, Tomo began to see his work differently. He was still grieving. He still felt lost much of the time. The darkness inside him hadn't disappeared. But he understood now that his inner state didn't invalidate his outer contribution. Ships still needed guidance. The light still saved lives. His pain didn't make the light less bright. He thought about all the people who probably felt as he did, broken, lost, inadequate, questioning their right to help others when they themselves were struggling. How many people stopped offering their gifts because they felt they weren't whole enough, healed enough, enlightened enough? A young woman from the village came to him one day troubled. She was training to be a healer, but felt overwhelmed by her own anxieties and doubts. "How can I help heal others when I'm so broken myself?" she asked. Tomo took her up to the lamp room and showed her the light. This lighthouse doesn't need to be whole to be useful. It just needs to do its job. You don't need to have conquered all your fears and healed all your wounds to help others. You just need to offer what you can offer. Your brokenness doesn't disqualify you from service. Sometimes it actually makes you better at it because you understand suffering from the inside. He told her about the sailor he had saved while feeling completely lost. The sailor didn't need me to be happy. He needed me to keep the light on. The people you help won't need you to be perfect. They'll need you to offer your skills, your compassion, your presence, whatever you're capable of giving. And you can give those things even while you're struggling. Word spread about the lighthouse keeper's teaching. People who had been holding back from helping others because of their own problems began to reconsider. The teacher who was battling depression realized she could still teach well, that her students didn't need her to be joyful, just knowledgeable and present. The counselor struggling with his own failed marriage recognized he could still help other couples, that his challenges didn't erase his insights. The mentor, dealing with doubt about his own life choices, saw that he could still guide younger people. That uncertainty about his own path didn't prevent him from illuminating options for others. Tomoe's grief gradually softened over time. Years passed, and while he never stopped missing his wife and feeling the absence of his son, the acute pain dulled into a quieter sadness. The darkness inside him became less consuming. But he never forgot the lesson of that period, that he had kept the light burning through his darkest time, that ships had been saved even while he felt lost, that his inner darkness hadn't stopped the outward light. One evening, many years later, an old sailor came to the lighthouse. "Do you remember me?" the sailor asked. "You saved my life 20 years ago. I was thrown overboard in a storm. I saw your light and swam to it." Tomoe did remember. That was the night I needed most to know that what I was doing mattered. "Well, it mattered," the sailor said. "I went on to have a family. 3 children, 7 grandchildren now. All of them exist because you kept that light burning. And you know what I learned that night? I learned that when you're drowning in darkness, you don't need someone who has all the answers. You just need someone who's holding a light, even if they're struggling to hold it, even if they're not sure why they're bothering. You just need the light. It doesn't matter if the keeper is lost. It matters that the light is there." Tonight, As you rest, you might consider what lights you've been withholding because you feel too broken to offer them. What help have you refused to give because you don't feel qualified, whole, or enlightened enough? What guidance have you withheld because you yourself feel lost? You don't need to have everything figured out to help someone else. You don't need to be healed completely to offer healing. You don't need to be free of darkness to hold light for others. The lighthouse keeper's inner darkness didn't stop ships from being saved. Your inner struggles don't invalidate the contribution you can make. Keep your light burning, even in your dark nights. Not because you're perfect, but because someone out there is swimming in darkness toward whatever light they can find. Your light might be the one that saves them. And it doesn't matter that you feel lost. It only matters that you're still showing up, still doing what you can do, still offering what you can offer. Rest now in the understanding that you can be broken and still be useful, lost and still guide others, full of darkness and still provides light. The lighthouse doesn't need to understand the journey to mark the safe passage. It just needs to keep shining. So do you. Your inner darkness doesn't disqualify you from helping others. Sometimes it's what qualifies you most, because you understand what it's like to need a light in the darkness. Sleep now, lighthouse keeper, knowing that even in your darkest nights, your light has been saving lives. It always has been. It always will be. The path of Zen unfolds like morning mist, soft and patient. In this next tale, we are invited to see, beyond appearance, into essence. Listen carefully to the next story. There was a master calligrapher named Kenzo who had spent 40 years perfecting his craft. He could write each character with flawless precision, every stroke exactly as the ancient masters had prescribed. His work was technically perfect, exhibited in galleries, and purchased by collectors who valued his adherence to classical standards. But Kenzo had a secret dissatisfaction. Despite the praise and recognition, his work felt lifeless to him. Each piece was an exercise in replication, a demonstration of technique, but nothing more. He was copying perfection that had been established centuries ago, adding nothing of himself, discovering nothing new. One day, an important patron commissioned a piece for a temple dedication. The character to be written was Mu, meaning emptiness or void. Kenzo prepared carefully, mixing his ink to exactly the right consistency, selecting his finest brush, and setting up his workspace with meticulous attention to every detail. He had practiced this character thousands of times. He knew exactly how it should look. He visualized every stroke in his mind, preparing to execute it perfectly. But as he positioned his brush above the paper, his cat, who normally slept quietly in the corner during his work, suddenly leapt onto the table. The cat's paw hit Kenzo's arm just as he was beginning the first stroke. The brush dragged across the paper in a completely unintended direction, creating a wild, irregular mark that bore no resemblance to proper calligraphy. Kenzo's first reaction was anger. The perfect paper was ruined. Hours of preparation wasted. He would have to start over, and he was already behind schedule. He grabbed the ruined piece, intending to crumple it and throw it away, but something made him pause. He looked at the mark more carefully. The stroke was wild, yes, completely improper by classical standards. But it had an energy, a life, a spontaneous quality that none of his careful, perfect strokes ever achieved. It looked like emptiness, like void, like the very essence of mu, in a way his technically correct versions never had. The mark captured something real about emptiness, its unpredictability, its resistance to control, its indifference to our intentions. His planned perfect versions had been illustrations of the concept. This accidental mark was somehow the thing itself. Kenzo sat staring at this mistake for over an hour. Finally, he decided to build the rest of the character around it, incorporating the wild stroke instead of starting over. The final piece was unlike anything he had ever created. It combined his technical skill with this element of pure accident, planned mastery with unplanned spontaneity. When he delivered the piece to his patron, he apologized. "I must confess, this isn't what I planned." My cat interfered, and the first stroke went completely wrong. I tried to salvage the piece, but it's not traditional calligraphy. I understand if you want me to create a new one. The patron studied the work in silence for a long time. Finally, he said, "This is the finest piece you've ever created." "But it's wrong," Kenzo protested. "The first stroke violates every principle of proper form." "It's alive," the patron replied. "Your other work is beautiful, technically flawless, but it's like looking at a preserved flower. This piece is like seeing a flower growing wild. It has breath in it, spontaneity, the quality of something happening right now rather than being carefully reconstructed from the past." He hung the piece in the temple, and people came from across the region to see it. Other calligraphers studied it, trying to understand how Kenzo had achieved such vitality. Some tried to recreate the effect by deliberately making mistakes. But these forced accidents never had the same quality. The life in Kenzo's piece came from the genuineness of the accident, not from calculated imperfection. A Zen master who viewed the piece said to Kenzo, "Your cat understood something you had forgotten, that true art comes from responding to the moment, not from executing a plan. For 40 years, you've been copying the past. In one moment of accident, you created something present." "But I can't plan accidents," Kenzo said. "I can't make this happen deliberately." "Exactly," the master replied. "That's why it worked. Your planning mind, your control, your perfection, all of that had to be interrupted for something real to emerge. The cat was your teacher." From that day forward, Kenzo's approach to calligraphy changed. He still practiced technique, still maintained his skills, but he stopped trying to control every aspect of the outcome. He began leaving space for accident, for the unexpected, for the moment to contribute its own wisdom. Sometimes he would start a piece without complete preparation, letting the consistency of the ink vary, allowing the paper to be slightly wrinkled, welcoming small imperfections. Sometimes he would work faster than was comfortable, not giving himself time to calculate every movement. Sometimes he would deliberately do something unusual, breaking a rule to see what would happen. Not every piece succeeded. Many experiments failed, but the successful pieces had a quality his earlier perfect work had lacked: presence, immediacy, life. They felt like they were happening rather than being displayed. They invited the viewer into an experience rather than presenting a completed achievement. Other calligraphers criticized this departure from classical standards. Kenzo has abandoned proper technique, they said. He's making mistakes deliberately. This isn't true calligraphy. But Kenzo understood something they didn't. Technique wasn't being abandoned. It was being liberated. He had spent 40 years building technical mastery. Now he was learning what to do with that mastery. Not to control and perfect, but to create conditions where truth could emerge spontaneously. The technique serves spontaneity, he would tell students. You practice until the movements are natural, until you don't have to think about them. Then you let go of trying to be perfect and allow something real to happen. The years of practice give you the skills. The letting go gives you the art. One student asked, "But how do you know when to let go? How do you know when you've practiced enough?" "You don't," Kenzo admitted. "I practiced for 40 years before my cat taught me to let go. Maybe that was too long. Maybe it wasn't long enough. The point isn't reaching some perfect amount of preparation. The point is remaining open to the moment when control needs to give way to spontaneity." He showed the student his temple piece with its wild first stroke. "I could never recreate this exactly. I could make similar pieces, but this particular mark came from this particular moment of accident." That's what makes it true. It's not a reproducible technique. It's a response to what actually happened. Years later, when Kenzo was old, he was asked to demonstrate calligraphy for the emperor. It was considered a great honor. Most calligraphers prepared extensively for such occasions, practicing for weeks to ensure a perfect demonstration. Kenzo prepared differently. He practiced just enough to be warmed up, then went to the demonstration with no fixed plan. He would respond to the moment, to the energy in the room, to whatever impulse arose. It was terrifying and exhilarating. As he stood before the emperor with brush and paper, he felt all his years of perfect control wanting to take over. The safe thing would be to execute a flawless classical piece. But instead, he paused, breathed, and let go of control. What emerged was neither perfectly planned nor completely accidental. It was something in between: technique meeting moment, skill dancing with spontaneity, the practiced hand responding to the unpracticed impulse. The character he created had both mastery and wildness, both tradition and innovation. When he finished, the emperor was silent for a moment, then said, "I have seen many demonstrations of perfect technique. This is the first time I've seen calligraphy that felt alive. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider where you're over-controlling, over-planning, and trying to perfect everything before you act. What would happen if you made space for accident, for spontaneity, for the moment to contribute its own wisdom? What if your careful plans are actually preventing something more true from emerging?" The perfect mistake teaches that life isn't lived according to plan. The most authentic moments come when planning gives way to presence, when control releases into response, when the prepared hand meets the unprepared moment. You don't need to have everything figured out. You don't need perfect execution. You need technique in the service of spontaneity, skill as a foundation for letting go. Rest now in the space between planning and accident, between control and release. Let yourself be like Kenzo's brush, prepared by practice, but freed from the need to be perfect. Tomorrow might bring a cat leaping onto your carefully prepared plans. Let it. The interruption might be the teacher. The accident might be the truth. The mistake might be perfect. In a village known for its textiles, there lived a master weaver named Hana, whose tapestries were sought after throughout the region. Her work was meticulous, each thread placed with precision, each pattern executed exactly as planned. She would design a piece completely in her mind before beginning, then weave it exactly as envisioned, allowing no deviation from her original plan. One day, Hana was working on her most ambitious piece yet, a large tapestry commissioned by a wealthy patron. She had been weaving for 3 weeks, and the pattern was emerging beautifully, exactly as she had planned it. The colors flowed in perfect harmony, the design unfolding with mathematical precision. Then disaster struck. As she reached for a spool of thread, her elbow knocked over a cup of tea. The liquid spilled across her loom, soaking into the partially completed tapestry and breaking several threads. Hana stared at the damage in horror. Weeks of work, ruined. The pattern disrupted. The threads broken in places she hadn't planned. Her carefully designed vision destroyed by one careless moment. Her first impulse was to tear it all down and start over. But the patron needed the piece in 2 weeks, and starting over would make meeting the deadline impossible. She would have to work with the damaged tapestry somehow. For a full day, Hana sat before the loom, paralyzed by frustration and disappointment. She kept seeing the tapestry as it should have been, comparing it to the broken reality before her. Every time she looked at the damaged sections, she felt her failure. Finally, her grandmother, who had taught Hana to weave, came to visit. The old woman looked at the damaged tapestry for a long time, saying nothing. "It's ruined," Hana said miserably. "All my planning, all my vision, destroyed." Her grandmother touched one of the broken threads gently. "Or changed," she said. "Ruined and changed are not the same thing." "But it's not what I planned. The pattern is broken." "Then make a new pattern," her grandmother said simply. "One that includes the break. Use the interruption as part of the design rather than fighting against it." Hana wanted to argue, wanted to insist that the original plan was the only right way. But she looked at her grandmother's eyes, which had seen 70 years of life's interruptions and changes, and stayed quiet. "When I was your age," her grandmother said, settling into a chair, "I believed that good weaving meant perfect execution of a predetermined plan. Any deviation was failure. Any interruption was disaster. I would throw away pieces that didn't match my vision, even if they were beautiful in their own way." She smiled, remembering. "Then one year, I was weaving a ceremonial cloth for a temple. I had planned an elaborate pattern of lotus flowers, but halfway through, I became very ill. I couldn't work for 2 months. When I finally returned to the loom, I had forgotten exactly what I'd planned. My hands had changed from the illness. My eyes saw colors slightly differently. I couldn't recreate my original vision even if I tried." "What did you do?" Hana asked. "I wept at first," her grandmother admitted. "I felt like I had failed. But then I started weaving again, not trying to force my memory of the original plan, but responding to what was actually there on the loom. Where I had forgotten the exact pattern, I improvised. Where my hands moved differently, I let them. Where my changed eyes saw colors differently, I trusted them." She leaned forward, and you know what? That piece became the most celebrated work I ever created. People still talk about it. They say it has a quality that my other work doesn't have, a kind of depth and authenticity. Because it wasn't just my plan executed perfectly. It was my plan interrupted by life, changed by circumstance, transformed by letting go of control. Hannah looked at her damaged tapestry with new eyes. What if she stopped seeing it as her failed plan and started seeing it as an opportunity? What if the broken threads weren't mistakes but invitations to create something she never would have imagined? She began to weave again, but differently. Where threads were broken, she wove in new colors, creating unexpected contrasts. Where the pattern was interrupted, she let it flow in new directions. Where tea stains had discolored sections, she added complementary shades that made the stains look intentional, like watercolor washes. The work became a dialogue between her original plan and the accidents that had interrupted it. She found herself excited by this conversation, by the surprise of not knowing exactly what would emerge, by the creativity required to work with interruption rather than against it. 2 weeks later, when she delivered the finished tapestry to the patron, she held her breath. It was not what she had promised. It was not what anyone had expected. The patron stared at it for a long time. Hannah prepared herself for disappointment, perhaps even for the commission to be rejected. Then the patron turned to her with tears in his eyes. "This is extraordinary," he said quietly. "It's unlike anything I've ever seen. There's something alive about it, something that speaks of real life rather than perfect planning. This pattern here, these unexpected color changes, this flow that seems both intentional and spontaneous. How did you create this?" Hannah told him the truth about the spilled tea, the broken threads, the ruined plan, the choice to work with the damage rather than starting over. The patron listened and nodded slowly. So this beauty came from accident and interruption, from things going wrong, from embracing what went wrong, Hannah clarified, from letting the interruption become part of the design rather than the enemy of it. The patron hung the tapestry in the place of highest honor in his home. People came from distant cities to see it. They would stand before it and feel something they couldn't quite name, a quality of authenticity that perfectly planned and executed works somehow lacked. Hannah's approach to weaving changed after that. She still planned her pieces, still brought skill and intention to her work, but she no longer demanded that reality conform perfectly to her plans. When threads broke, when colors ran differently than expected, when her hands moved in ways she hadn't intended, she learned to see these interruptions as collaborators rather than enemies. Her later work was marked by this quality of collaboration with accident. She became known for tapestries that felt alive, that contained both intention and surprise, that spoke of a weaver who had learned to dance with interruption rather than fight against it. When students came to learn from her, she would tell them the story of the spilled tea and the broken threads. "Life will interrupt your plans," she would say. "This is not a problem to solve, but a truth to accept." The question is not how to prevent interruption, but how to weave it into the pattern. How to let it teach you, change you, take you places your plan never would have gone. She would show them her most celebrated piece, the one born from disaster. "This taught me that my plans are not sacred. They're just starting points. What emerges when plan meets reality, when intention meets accident, when control meets surrender, that's where the real art lives. Not in perfect execution of a predetermined vision, but in the creative response to all the ways reality refuses to conform to our vision. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider how life has interrupted your plans, the ways things haven't gone as you envisioned, the broken threads in your own tapestry. Are you still fighting against these interruptions, trying to force reality back to your original plan? Or can you begin to weave them into a new pattern, one you never would have imagined, but that might be more beautiful, more authentic, more true than your original vision? Your life is not a failed plan. It's a collaborative creation between your intentions and reality's interruptions. And sometimes the interruptions are the best parts, the threads of color you never would have chosen, but that make the whole piece come alive. Rest now in acceptance of all the broken threads, all the spilled tea, all the ways your carefully laid plans have been disrupted. These are not failures. They're invitations to create something new, something real, something that could only emerge from the collaboration between what you intended and what actually happened. In the hush of understanding, Zen offers us another glimpse of what it means to recognize worth not by weight or shine, but by presence. Here starts the next story. On the coast of a small fishing village, there lived an old fisherman named Takeshi, who had cast his nets into the sea for more than 50 years. While other fishermen in the village would return each day with boats full of fish, Takeshi's catch was often modest. Yet he seemed more content than any of them, humming to himself as he mended his nets, smiling at the horizon as if it were an old friend. The other fishermen couldn't understand it. They had newer boats, stronger nets, better equipment. They worked longer hours, went farther out to sea, employed every technique they knew to maximize their catch. Yet they always seemed worried about competition, worried about the weather, worried about next season, worried about whether they were catching enough. One day, a young fisherman named Hiro, ambitious and frustrated by his own mediocre catches despite his hard work, approached Takeshi as the old man sat mending his net on the dock. "Old uncle," Hiro said, using the term of respect though they weren't related. "May I ask you something?" Takeshi looked up, his weathered face crinkling into a smile. "Of course, young one. Sit." Hiro sat beside him, watching the old man's gnarled fingers work the net with practiced ease. "How do you stay so peaceful? Your catch is often smaller than ours, yet you never seem worried. You never seem to be rushing or striving. What is your secret?" Takeshi held up a section of his net, spreading it between his hands so the light came through the gaps. "Tell me, Hiro, what is a net made of?" Hiro looked at the net, confused by the simple question. "Rope, I suppose. Woven rope with knots." "Look closer," Takeshi said, shaking the net gently. "What else do you see?" Hiro studied it more carefully. The rope formed a pattern, yes, but between each strand. "Holes," he said. "The net is full of holes." "Exactly," Takeshi said, his eyes twinkling. "A net is more whole than rope, yes. The holes are what make it a net. Without the holes, it would just be a sheet of cloth, useless for catching fish." "I don't understand what this has to do with my question." Takeshi set down the net and looked out at the water. When I was young, like you, I wanted to catch every fish in the sea. I would cast my net and then grip the ropes so tightly, pulling hard, afraid that fish would escape. My hands would bleed from holding so tight. My arms would ache from pulling so hard. And you know what happened? What? The fish would sense the violence of it, the desperation. The net would move through the water roughly, and fish would avoid it. Or they would escape through holes that my tight gripping actually made larger. The harder I tried to hold everything, the more I lost. Hiro leaned forward, interested now. One day, Takeshi continued, I was very tired. My hands hurt. My heart hurt from constant worry. I cast my net almost carelessly, too exhausted to grip tight, too worn out to pull hard. I just let the net sink naturally, let the current move it gently, and pulled it back with soft hands. And that day, my catch was the best I'd ever had. I don't see how that's possible, Hiro said. If you don't hold tight, won't everything escape? Takeshi picked up the net again. Watch. He held one section very tightly in his fist. When I clench like this, look what happens to the net. The holes close up, the rope bunches. The net becomes smaller, more rigid. Now watch. He opened his hand, holding the net loosely across his palm. See? The holes open, the net expands. It becomes larger, more flexible. It can hold more because I'm holding it less. He let the net rest on his lap and looked at Hiro with those eyes that had seen half a century of sunrises over water. This is true for fish, and it's true for everything else in life. The tighter we grip, the more we lose. The more desperately we hold on, the more brittle things become. But when we hold loosely, gently, with open hands, things stay naturally. But isn't that risky? Hiro asked. What if everything falls through? What is falling through right now? Takeshi asked gently. You have a boat. You have nets. You have your health. You have this sea. What exactly are you afraid of losing that you don't already risk losing by worrying about it constantly? Hiro had no answer. He realized he spent so much energy protecting what he had, so much effort trying to guarantee future security, that he was exhausted and unhappy even though nothing had actually gone wrong yet. I see in you what I was, Takeshi said. You grip your life with tight fists. Your boat, your catch, your reputation, your future. You're trying to hold all of it so tightly that your hands hurt and your heart is tired. But you cannot control the sea. You cannot control the fish. You cannot control tomorrow. The only thing your tight grip accomplishes is making you suffer today. So what should I do? Hiro asked. Cast your net with care, but without desperation. Pull it back with attention, but without force. Let the sea be the sea. Let the fish be the fish. Do your work, do it well, but hold the results loosely. Some days the catch will be good, some days it will be modest, some days the net will come back empty. All of this is part of fishing, part of life. When you stop fighting against this truth, when you stop gripping so tightly, something relaxes. And often, that's when everything you need comes naturally. Hiro sat with this teaching for a long time, watching the waves, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones. He thought about how tightly he had been holding everything in his life, his ambitions, his worries, his plans, his fears. His whole body ached from the effort of it. The next morning, when Hiro went out to fish, he tried something different. He cast his net with the same care as always, but without the desperate energy he usually brought. He didn't clench the ropes. He didn't pull with all his might. He simply allowed the net to do what a net does, and he guided it gently back to the boat. His catch that day wasn't dramatically bigger, but he noticed something else. The work felt easier. His shoulders didn't ache as much. His mind wasn't churning with anxiety. And when some fish escaped through the holes, which they always did, which they always would, he didn't feel it as a personal failure. It was just fish being fish. Over time, Hero's entire approach to fishing changed. And gradually, his entire approach to life changed with it. He held his plans more loosely. He gripped his expectations less tightly. He let people in his life be who they were without trying to control them. He stopped trying to grip the future with tight fists. Years later, young fishermen would come to Hero, asking the same question he had once asked Takeshi, and he would show them a net, spreading it in the light, teaching them about the holes that make it work. Life is like this net, he would say. It's mostly empty space, mostly things we cannot hold or control. And that's not a problem. That's what makes it work. Hold everything loosely, your work, your relationships, your achievements, your plans. Hold them with care, yes, but without that desperate grip that closes up the holes and makes everything smaller, harder, more brittle. Open your hands. Let life flow through them. You'll lose some things, yes, but you'll find you can hold so much more when you stop holding so tightly. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, you might notice where you're gripping too tightly. What are you holding with clenched fists? What are you trying to control that cannot be controlled? What would happen if you opened your hands just a little and held everything more gently? The net of your life is mostly holes, mostly space, mostly mystery. This is not a flaw in the design. This is what makes it work. Hold it loosely. Let the holes be holes. Let some things escape. You cannot catch everything, and you were never meant to. But what stays when you hold it gently stays because it wants to, not because you forced it. And that makes all the difference. In a mountain monastery, there hung an ancient bronze bell in the temple courtyard. For 300 years, this bell had marked the rhythms of monastic life, calling monks to meditation at dawn, to meals at midday, to evening prayers as the sun set behind the peaks. Its deep, resonant tone could be heard throughout the valley, a voice of bronze that spoke of continuity, of tradition, of the sacred order of things. The monastery's youngest monk, a boy named Jiro, who had arrived only months before, had never known silence. He had grown up in a busy city where noise was constant. Street vendors calling, cartwheels clattering, neighbors arguing, merchants haggling, temple bells of a dozen different shrines all competing to be heard. When he came to the monastery, that single bell had seemed like a blessing. Just one sound, pure and clear, marking time with dignity. But Jiro took the bell for granted. He had heard it so many times that he no longer really heard it at all. It was just background, just part of the environment, no more remarkable than the sound of wind or the call of birds. When it rang for dawn meditation, he would stumble from his sleeping mat, still half asleep. When it rang for meals, he was often already hungry and irritated by the wait. The bell was just a signal, a command, nothing more. One autumn, the monastery's abbot, a man named Eshun, who rarely spoke but seemed to notice everything, made an unusual decision. Without explanation or announcement, he ordered that the bell should not be rung. Not for one day, but indefinitely. The bell ringer, a senior monk who had performed this duty for 20 years, looked confused but obeyed. The next morning, Jiro woke in darkness, unsure of the time. He lay there waiting for the familiar sound that would tell him dawn had arrived, that it was time to rise, time to begin the day. But no sound came. He waited longer, growing anxious. Had he somehow slept through it? Was he late? Would he be in trouble? Finally, he stumbled out into the courtyard and found other monks there, all looking similarly confused. Some had woken too early and been waiting. Others, like Jiro, had woken late, uncertain. Master Eishun appeared and said only, "No bell today. Perhaps no bell tomorrow. We shall see. Now please sit for meditation." They sat, but Jiro found it almost impossible to concentrate. He kept listening for the bell. His body expected it. His mind waited for it. Even though he knew it wouldn't ring, he couldn't stop anticipating its sound. The silence where the bell should have been was louder than the bell itself had ever been. At midday, there was no bell to call them to their meal. Some monks arrived too early and had to wait. Others came too late and found the food already distributed. The careful rhythm of the day, which had been marked by the bell for 300 years, had suddenly disappeared. Time became elastic, uncertain, strange. Evening came with no bell to mark the day's transition into night. Jiro sat in the courtyard, looking at the bell hanging silent in its wooden frame. He had passed this bell dozens of times each day for months. But he realized now that he had never really looked at it. Now, in its silence, he saw it clearly for the first time. He noticed the beautiful patina of the bronze, the way 3 centuries of weather had given it a green-black color that seemed to hold depth, like looking into deep water. He saw the intricate decorations cast into its surface, dragons and lotus flowers, and Sanskrit characters worn smooth by time. He noticed how the bell hung perfectly balanced, how the slightest touch would set it swinging, ready to speak at any moment, but choosing silence instead. Days passed, then weeks. The monks adapted to life without the bell. They learned to sense the time from the light, from the position of shadows, from the feeling in their own bodies. They became more attentive to natural rhythms, rather than relying on the bronze voice to tell them what to do. But something else happened too. The bell's absence created a different kind of presence. Monks found themselves thinking about it constantly. The silence, where the bell should have been, became a teaching in itself. One evening, Jiro approached Master Eishun in the garden. "Master," he said, bowing, "may I ask why the bell no longer rings?" Eishun looked up from the herbs he was tending. "Does it not ring? Or do you finally hear it?" Jiro frowned, confused. "I hear nothing, Master. That's the problem. The bell is silent." "Sit," Eishun said, gesturing to the ground beside him. Jiro sat. "When the bell rang every day," Eishun said, "did you hear it?" "Of course, Master. We all heard it." "Did you really?" "Tell me about the sound. Describe it to me." Jiro opened his mouth and found he couldn't. He had heard the bell hundreds of times, but he couldn't describe its tone, its resonance, its particular voice. He had heard it so often that he had stopped actually listening. "You heard the command," Eshun said gently. "Wake up. Come here. Do this." But did you hear the bell itself? Did you appreciate its voice? Did you feel gratitude for its faithful service? Or had it become invisible to you, just part of the background noise of your life? Jiro felt something catch in his throat. The master was right. He had taken the bell completely for granted. "Now," Eshun continued, "now that it's silent, you think about it constantly. You notice it. You see it hanging there. You appreciate what it was. The absence has taught you to see what presence never could. This is why the bell is silent. Not because I wanted to take it away from you, but because I wanted to give it back to you. Sometimes we must lose something to truly find it." Jiro looked at the bell hanging in the courtyard, silhouetted against the darkening sky. He understood now. When the bell rang, it was just a tool, just a function. But in its silence, it had become a teacher. "There is another lesson here," Eshun said, standing up and brushing dirt from his robes. "We spend our lives filling every moment with sound, with activity, with doing. We are afraid of silence, afraid of absence, afraid of empty space. But silence teaches, absence reveals. The spaces between notes are what make music music. The pauses between words are what make speech meaningful. The rest between breaths is what makes breathing possible." He started walking toward the temple, then paused and looked back at Jiro. "The bell will ring again someday. But when it does, I hope you will hear it differently. I hope you will hear not just the sound, but the silence it emerges from. Not just the command it carries, but the gift it offers. And I hope you will remember that sometimes the deepest teaching comes not from what is present, but from what is absent." That night, lying on his sleeping mat, Jiro listened to the silence where the bell should have been. But it wasn't really silence, he realized. He could hear wind moving through trees. He could hear his own breathing. He could hear the small sounds of the monastery settling into sleep. These sounds had always been there, but the bell had covered them. Its absence revealed a whole world of subtle sound he had never noticed. 3 months later, on the first morning of winter, Master Ishan gave the signal. The bell rang again. The sound that rolled across the courtyard was the most beautiful thing Jiro had ever heard. It was deep and rich and full of resonance. It spoke of time and patience and faithful service. It spoke of continuity and change. It spoke of presence and absence, sound and silence, all woven together. Tears came to Jiro's eyes as he listened. He wasn't crying from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of finally, truly hearing something he had taken for granted for so long. From that day forward, every time the bell rang, Jiro would pause, really pause, and listen. And in listening to the bell, he learned to listen to everything more deeply. He learned that things reveal themselves most fully when we risk losing them. He learned that absence can be a kind of presence. He learned that what we take for granted becomes invisible until it's taken away. Years later, when Jiro became the bell ringer himself, he would sometimes let a full day pass in silence, just as Master Eshun had done. The younger monks would complain, would feel lost without their marker, their signal, their command. And Jiro would smile, remembering his own confusion. his own eventual understanding. The bell is always teaching, he would tell them, in sound and in silence, in presence and in absence. When you learn to hear both, you begin to understand that they are not opposites, but partners in the same dance. As you settle into rest tonight, you might notice what's absent from this moment, not in a sad way, but with curiosity. What sounds are you not hearing? What worries are not present right now? What problems are not demanding your attention in this very instant? Absence has gifts to offer. The space where sound isn't is what makes sound possible. The silence where words aren't is what makes words meaningful. The emptiness where thought isn't is what makes awareness possible. Let yourself rest in what's not here, not as loss, but as space. Empty space, silent space, open space. And in that space, you might discover a presence more profound than anything that makes noise or demands attention. You might discover that sometimes the deepest teaching, the deepest rest, the deepest peace comes not from adding something, but from letting something fall away. The bell is silent now, and in that silence, everything speaks. As the lantern of awareness glows a little brighter, we come to a tale about seeing with more than the eyes. Let the stillness guide you now, and listen carefully to the next story.